The prince came closer to her and asked if he could ask her a question that was bothering him. Looking into his beautiful blue eyes, she replied that she didn't mind, but inside she was already trying to come up with a suitable answer. At the same time, she felt extremely awkward. He stood towards her too quickly, making her heart tremble. She was right. It was about the Librum flower. Alexandrite needed to know where she heard about it. Even though Arya knew that this issue would be raised someday, she was still embarrassed inside. He helped her by suggesting that she might have heard about him from legends she had been told as a child. And about the healing properties of its nectar, she immediately seized on this hint and confirmed that she had been read fairy tales about it. However, as he touched her hair, he noted that it was not so much about the flower itself, but about why she gave it to him. Lifting her head, he said that no one knew about his illness. So can the Count's daughter answer him this question? How did she manage to find out that he had an illness that others did not suspect? She could think of nothing better to say than that the flower had caught her eye by chance. However, he replied that this was impossible, because it only grows in an ice temple, which is located somewhere in the northern lands. Only once did a holy virgin visit there, but this legend was already more than 100 years old. She described it in one of her books, but now she herself is no longer alive. Arianel thought to herself that she probably shouldn't have done this, but there was no turning back. Alexandrite continued and said that he had been hunting for this flower for so long, and now he was holding it in his hands, thanks to the Count's ordinary daughter. Leaning towards her, he was too close. It was difficult for her to lie in such a situation. In a soft voice, he continued to speak, holding the ribbon from her hair in his hands, that if she wanted to harm him, she would have to be punished. She immediately began to assure that she would never have dared to even think about such a thing. Looking into his eyes, she realized that there was no trace of reproach or anger in them. But she still asked for forgiveness because even if she told the whole truth, he would not believe her. It was all so unreal that she herself would not have believed it if she had heard it from someone else. Her heart was beating faster and faster. She understood that just a little more and she would not be able to bear it at all. And it happened. She fell. Her spirit was about to leave the body that had been at her disposal for so short a time. She felt that her life was ending, but she did not regret anything. Even though this was her second life, she was full of love and the desire to make her loved one happy. Her first life was different. She was slowly walking home after work when it started. At that time, her name was Sato Asuka. She was already 30 years old, and she worked as a high school teacher. She kept sitting on her phone, waiting for the notification that the last part of the book she loved so much was coming out. And then she realized that she had hesitated too long and was late. The bus that was supposed to take her home had already left the stop. She ran, but it was too late. The driver didn't notice her, nor did the other passengers, who didn't care about her. Asuka stood on the street angry and confused, wondering what to do next. She could have called a taxi, then she would have gotten there faster, but she invested all the money in donations for her favorite work, the new chapter of which was supposed to be released today. The piece was called The Weaving of the Precious Prince's Love, and she had a favorite. Although the choice was not easy, all three were real beauties, but she was rooting for only one. Most of the people voted for another prince, but she knew that her favorite deserved more. And for his sake, she was ready to do anything. He became her ray of light in a boring, unremarkable life. It was hard to even imagine that an adult girl could fall so deeply in love with the hero of a novel, but his entire description, as well as the regularly posted drawings, spoke in his favor. He was magnificent with his blue hair, blue eyes, and powerful torso. Asuka couldn't resist and did everything to make sure that he would be the winner in the vote for the best book hero. He had to be the first. Everything in her wanted him to win this battle where hundreds of other girls were choosing his brothers. So, sitting in her dreams, she went on foot, sparing nothing for her favorite. As a child, she liked teachers from dramas. She wanted to be like them. She thought that in the presence of students, she would be able to forever preserve the spirit of youth. But in reality, it turned out to be hard and thankless work that took up all my time. He wasn't even there for lunch. She was always busy checking homework or working with students. Fatigue and stress accumulated like a snowball. She did not even find time for herself, let alone for her personal life. It didn't matter how much she did, her salary remained the same. Asuka no longer remembered how many times she doubted such a life. She was deeply disappointed with what she received, but she could not get out of this vicious circle. Once she almost drowned in her own bathtub due to extreme fatigue. But one day, she followed an advertising link to a book group, and there she saw him, the one with whom she fell completely and unreservedly in love. One of the characters became much closer to her than the people around her. Moreover, it was possible to read this novel while the chapters had not yet been published. She never knew how it would end. It was a very ordinary reverse harem story in a fantasy world. 3 handsome princes sought the favor of a girl who was a saint, and in her she met Alexandrite. He is an elegant gentleman, kind, warm-hearted, decent, with a sad backstory. He keeps silent about his fatal illness, but at the same time he sincerely loves the saint. The main character is a holy virgin. She is the daughter of a duke, even a candidate for queen. She has a sweet character and a great sense of justice. Walking slowly home, Asuka recalled how she was drawn into reading this novel, which became a real salvation for her. He distracted her from her sad everyday life, and the chapters came out regularly, and she waited for each of them with great impatience. It was today that a new part was supposed to come out, in which a lot would be decided. There were even reports that it would be the last one. As she walked home, Asuka kept dreaming that in this chapter her beloved would finally become happy. She was sorry that this affair was ending, but she had a chance to get one last satisfaction. At the same time, she had to prepare tests and check notebooks. She had not slept for a whole day to get everything done, but now she was completely free for 20 minutes of bliss. Although she looked quite tired, the continuation of the novel was worth it. She imagined his voice, his movements. She wanted to capture every detail, every word he had to say. So Asuka decided to drink a couple of energy drinks to stay on top of bliss for another 20 minutes before tomorrow. However, reading it turned out to be far from inspiring. All the time she was screaming in her head for Alexandrite to hold on. But when she read that he would only love one Marin even in heaven, Asuka's heart sank. In the end, he died in the arms of his beloved, which led to loud sobs from the young teacher, who did not expect such an outcome. Asuka couldn't help but let her tears flow as she sat there wearing a t-shirt with his image on it. At the same time, it was clear that something like this was possible, but not so abruptly. Looking around her room with an empty gaze, she still could not believe that his life would end and that he would not find true happiness. Because of this disorder, she cried loudly until the morning, replaying the subsequent events in her head. After his death, Marin went to his main rival, Alexandrite. However, she couldn't understand why the book ended so unfairly when he had such a great chance. Asuka, her head resting on the table, thought about how the only joy in her life had been taken away from her. And then suddenly everything started spinning and some buildings emerged from the pink fog. Asuka didn't understand what was happening to her. She touched her face and it seemed to her that her whole body was aching. She bent over, crouching, not understanding what the hell had happened or why her back was hurting so much. In the reflection of the shop window, she saw a pink-haired girl who was dressed in a strange outfit. Asuka's eyes widened, looking at herself, not understanding what was going on. She was wearing some unusual clothes that seemed quite heavy compared to her usual clothes. There was something completely incomprehensible around, since she even saw a cart with horses. Asuka could understand what kind of horses, what was going on here in general. Everything around her surprised her. She didn't understand where she was. Maybe it was a dream. At the same time, she felt as if her body was being broken. Everything hurt so much. But her surroundings captured her attention even more, so she stopped paying attention to this pain. Asuka saw a real castle in front of her. This couldn't be, because in the modern world they don't build castles. However, judging by the description I recall, it was a castle from a novel in which 3 princes lived. This became even more difficult as someone called out to her from behind. The voice seemed vaguely familiar. It certainly belonged to someone noble, as there was a sense of firmness and strength in the notes. She turned around and didn't understand if this was really real. Right in front of her, in a cloak, stood Alexandrite. Asuka thought that she had died and entered the world of her dreams. But it was he who looked at her with his beautiful blue eyes, a calm and firm gaze. She opened her eyes even wider and then did something she never expected. She screamed as if she had seen a ghost, but was convinced that she was most likely in virtual reality. When he asked her if she was okay, she responded with short interjections, unable to find the words. However, he extended his hand to her, quite unexpectedly, after which he said that she had turned very pale. Looking at him, she thought that this was a dream. Most likely, everything would disappear now. All she had to do was reach out her hand to him, so that everything would dissipate and she would understand that it was not real. Asuka was completely sure that she was dreaming, so she decided not to miss the opportunity to touch his hand. She expected her hand to pass through his fingers, but instead she felt the touch of skin. Asuka was shocked, as she didn't expect that one could feel everything so strongly in a dream. She felt not only the muscles in his fingers, but also the warmth that emanated from his hand. That is, everything was real. At least that's what it really seemed to her. Alexandrite asked if she was in so much pain, why she looked so confused, to which she could not find what to answer. He asked if she was even able to speak, but she kept holding his hand and couldn't tear herself away. And then suddenly, as if struck by electricity, she realized what was happening and acted in a completely unexpected way. As if looking at herself from the outside, she understood that she was standing next to the prince of her dreams. She could not confuse him with anyone else, because this blue hair, earrings in his ears, all this was so precise. She kept looking, but panic was already beginning to show in her heart. Asuka opened her mouth, trying to respond, but realized it would be useless. After that, she asked for forgiveness for daring to touch him and ran away as fast as she could. Alexandrite was left perplexed. He had absolutely no idea what he could have done to frighten this girl. She ran, the whole picture blurred before her, strange people in strange clothes, strange pavement. Everything around was so unfamiliar, so incomprehensible, but she knew that she had to run quickly. However, the speed played a cruel joke. Her head simply started spinning, and her eyes were filled with fragments of what she had seen. Horses she had never seen before in her life stood next to the carriages. There were strange fountains that were located in the middle of reservoirs in a completely incomprehensible way. Even some place that looked like a cafe, it all reminded her of the descriptions in the novel. She ran and did not understand how this was even possible, how she even ended up here. That's why she didn't look at her feet at all, which led to her tripping over a lying stone. Apparently, her agility had deserted her after sleepless nights, as she simply flew onto the pavement. Asuka was stretched out right in the middle of the road. People were looking at her around her, but that wasn't what worried her the most. She felt like she was in a lot of pain, but she couldn't figure out what exactly she had hit herself with so much force. Apparently it was her forehead. Her legs also hurt, so she began to understand that this was not a dream, but reality. She wondered if she was really in the novel she loved so much, where the prince was real. Then she remembered that there really were many stories about reincarnation, but she didn't think that something like this could happen to her. Asuka tried to calm down, remembering how she read stories about reincarnation in other worlds, thinking that perhaps this was the real experience of the authors. Then it turned out that she really had just seen her favorite. She had just spoken to him and even touched him with her fingertips. Did she really manage to do this together with her deity, the hero of the book, with whom she was in love? And then her nose started bleeding. Although she had never suffered from this before, she couldn't understand what was happening. Holding back the bleeding, she thought about how she was breathing the same air as her deity, and whether the god had taken pity on her. Did he really decide to give her the chance to live next to her angel? Because it was an incredible gift. Then she wondered how she had ended up here and why, although she didn't give a damn about it. Asuka realized that now she had a chance to save her beloved. It was worth a lot. However, it was necessary to figure out and understand who she had become in this life. Maybe she was some kind of servant. She had the picture in her head that she had imagined when she found out that Alexandrite was going to die, and it was keeping her from concentrating. She understood perfectly well that if nothing was done, he would definitely die. Asuka tried to figure out what time period she had been placed in, how long the events would continue to unfold, and how much time she had to solve this problem. Apparently, it was spring now, which meant that it was only the very beginning of all events, and she had time. However, then she looked around and remembered that the surroundings reminded her of something. She stood and looked at this fountain, as well as at the building behind it, and understood that this was a place of important events. After all, it was here that Marin, Onyx, and Alexandrite collided, and then events began to develop rapidly. Onyx saved Marin, and a spark flew between them that would make Marin look at him differently. She will treat the brother of her favorite character Asuka better, and then nothing will be possible to change. And if a relationship starts between Onyx and Marin, then Alexandrite will not have a single chance and he will die. As soon as she thought about this, events that were already known to her began to happen. She heard a sweet female voice asking her to let go. It could only belong to the main character. Looking back, she saw a girl with a basket of bread in her hand, surrounded by some rough guys. They asked her who gave her the right to trade here. Marin answered that she simply distributes bread to those in need. The guys said it was boring and invited her to have fun with them. Marin began to refuse, and Asuka understood that this was the very scene after which everything would be decided. This means that her little angel's main rival must be hanging around somewhere nearby. The stately, black-haired Onyx was beautiful, but Asuka's heart already belonged to Alexandrite. so when she saw him, she was irritated to the depths of her soul. Her head was working in turbo mode. She was trying to figure out what she should do now to change the situation. It was clear that she did not want to allow Marin and Onyx to meet. Being a mathematician, she composed several equations in her head. It was necessary to find the best outcome. Her thoughts began to clear and she made a decision. It seemed brilliant to her, but there was no time to waste, so she immediately rushed to carry it out. Asuka ran into the nearest women's clothing store, where she already knew exactly what she needed to buy. She simply pointed her finger and told him to sell her an outfit that was sure to attract attention. From a dull and decently dressed scruffy woman, she turned into a rather eccentric person in a matter of seconds. Events in the square continued to unfold when she returned there. Onyx had already heard Marin's voice and realized that someone needed help, but he didn't have time to do anything. There was a loud click of heels, and then it was as if a wind had passed him. He left behind a fresh scent next to him, and only flying pink hair remained in his memory. He was unable to react in any way, as he did not even have time to assess the situation. At that moment, the men grabbed Marin by the arms and tried to take her away with them, but she desperately resisted. She tried to call for help, but her voice was very quiet, and in such a situation it simply did not help. From the sudden jerk, she felt that the buns were starting to spill out of the basket. She helplessly continued to call for help, no longer looking at the falling bread. However, at that moment a loud voice was heard calling on the hooligans to listen to him. Asuka had already decided that since she was reborn in this world, she would definitely save the life of her beloved. In her eccentric clothes, she began to attract the attention of hooligans, inviting them to go with her. They were shocked by the unexpected intervention, but she herself was not at all embarrassed. After all, she had read more than one novel, and she knew that a villain always stands between the heroine and the hero. Asuka will constantly interfere with Marin and Onyx's interactions in order to achieve her goals. Then the young saint will choose Alexandrite, and he will find the happiness he deserves. If it came down to it, she needed to dress as flamboyantly as possible to attract the pathetic crowd of rude people. However, she succeeded the first time after her call. They immediately turned to face her. The teacher rejoiced in her soul, because if Alexandrite married Marin, he would definitely become king. And then all over the country there will be statues erected to glorify him, and she herself will become his good fairy, who will do everything so that he can live a long and happy life. So, dressed in bright clothes, she decided to take the first step that would prevent the main character from falling in love with Onyx. To do this, she just needed to protect her by taking the fire onto herself. The people who turned around were somewhat shocked. She behaved rather vulgarly, but she still did not know who she was in this world. Asuka herself believed that she had chosen the perfect image for the villain. However, then Marin turned to her and asked what Madame Arianel was doing here looking like that. Asuka didn't expect such a turn of events. She still didn't know who she had been reborn into, and she didn't have time to think about it. Who is Mrs. Arianel and what does she do was also a separate question, so it was necessary to somehow get out of the situation. She already wanted to ask Marin how they met and who she was, but her thoughts were confused. It was already bad that they turned out to be acquaintances, because then her whole plan would go to hell. Moreover, she had heard this name somewhere, but she did not remember anything connected with it. Who is she then here in this world? A servant, or some high-ranking person? However, Marin reminded her that they had crossed paths before and that she was the Count's daughter. But this did not solve anything. Marin wanted to leave with her savior, but she was roughly grabbed by the arm. One of the villains said he was not finished yet and began to break her arm. The newly minted Arianel thought that something needed to be done urgently, since she had already spent her initial ardor. But something completely unexpected happened. Some kind of fury appeared. Moreover, this fragile-looking woman scattered all the hooligans in 2 counts. Arianel already thought that she was the main character, but for some reason she didn't remember her from the book. All the hooligans were scared and ran away in all directions, but the situation did not become clearer, but only became more complicated. One of the most impudent decided that he could resist the fragile woman, but this was his big mistake. He immediately received a punch to the jaw that would make even the best boxers envious. The woman who defeated all the rude people seemed to her like a real angel who saved her from a very difficult situation. In Asuka Arianel's eyes, she was a real strong woman who hadn't even hurt herself one bit. However, the next moment was completely unexpected, as tears began to flow from the woman's eyes and she began to wail in a tearful voice. After which she threw herself into Arianel's arms with all her might, grabbing her with all her might. The strong woman squeezed her in her arms so tightly that Arianel thought she was about to give up the ghost. The girl read everything, calling her Mrs. Ariana, that she had only gone away for a second to buy her some crepes, and in the end, some scum had accosted her. After that, she threw it over her shoulders, continuing to say that her heart almost stopped when she realized that her mistress was missing. After this, the girl asked Marin for forgiveness for her mistress's behavior. Then, placing her more comfortably on her shoulder, she said that it was time for them to return to the mansion. Arianel was completely out of touch with events and did not understand where and why she should return, because she still did not understand who she had been reborn as. She thought to herself that she really needed to read books more carefully. There was no guarantee that she would become the main character. However, at this time, Onyx appeared on the square, who was about to cross paths with Marin. Arianel screamed at the top of her voice, trying to stay, but the strong woman, who was not paying any attention to her, was carrying her somewhere. Remembering how she dealt with a bunch of strong men, it was clear that it would not be so easy to deal with her. The woman loaded her into the carriage without even breaking a sweat. At this time they were being watched, and by a completely unexpected person. He looked at the coat of arms on the carriage, which indicated that the girl with pink hair was a representative of a noble family. Thus Alexandrite understood that the girl he met was the daughter of Count Foxknight. Then a servant ran up to him and asked what the prince was doing there, since he had been looking for him everywhere. Harry immediately noticed that the prince had changed somehow. He seemed to brighten up. Alex turned to him and said that he had one small task. Arianel came to her senses in a completely different place. She still did not understand where she was and who she was. But she was lying on a huge, luxurious bed. Everything around was cozy and beautiful. There was a doctor standing nearby who said that she most likely had memory loss related to the head injury she had received. At this time, the strong woman sat next to her and lamented, asking her for forgiveness. In fact, the conclusions about memory loss were made even earlier, when, sitting in the carriage, Arya asked this girl who she was. She cried out that the injury was too severe, so Arianel did not recognize her own servant Nadia. On the other hand, Asuka decided that this was a very convenient situation, since she still didn't know her birthday, the second highest mountain in the country, or what she ate yesterday, and the memories didn't come. In books about reincarnation in another world, the heroes usually retained the memories of the body into which they were reborn. But apparently this was a different case, so her amnesia was quite useful. The problem was that Arianel addressed the maid respectfully, which irritated her. In fact, this strong woman, whose name was Nadia, was very close to her in spirit, but she did not know how to address her. She reminded her that she was Mistress Ariana, and her maid was obliged to look after her while her parents were away. Arianel was, frankly speaking, delighted that she not only had a beautiful servant, but also a very strong one. It seemed that she was ready to conquer the whole world just to save her girl. However, there was still a lot that was unclear, since without the heroine's memories, she had to get out on her own. But she learned from Nadia that Arianel was the eldest daughter of Count Foxknight. She was 18 years old, and her parents were currently away. She was a very sickly child since childhood, and only recently made her debut in high society on the same day as Marin. It was on the day of her debut that she caught a fever, so she had to return home immediately, and since then she has never been to a ball. Despite the fact that she is the heiress of a noble family, she still has no suitors. That was all the useful information that could be extracted. No one was interested in a girl with poor health. Otherwise, Nadia adored Ariana, so she could talk about her for hours. She talked about what an angel she was when she was little, and also a lot of unnecessary information. Arya decided that in any case, it was a great success to immediately find out about the current state of this body. So she, somewhat afraid that she would be punished by heaven, still said that she was grateful to Ariana for the fact that she fell so effectively and hit her head. Now at least it was possible to act under the guise of memory loss, and collecting information would not be so difficult. At that moment there was a knock, and a servant brought a letter from the royal palace. It was an invitation to a royal ball, although she had never been invited since that incident. She remembered that this was the very event during which much would be decided in the book. It all took place in the palace of the emperor, who was organizing a ball for all the noble gentlemen. However, there was still a lot of time left before that, and at this time, the emperor's family was sitting at the table and discussing him. While the adults were away, two brothers, Onyx and Citrine, were talking to each other. The younger one said that something had happened to Alexandrite. He himself had invited some girl to the upcoming ball. Onyx didn't see anything special in this, but Citrine pointed out that their older brother never did that. He noted that the girl was probably a real beauty, but the middle prince said that he was not interested in this. The younger one insisted that they would soon have to choose a bride for themselves. Onyx didn't answer, but he made such a face that the younger decided to tease him. He noted that he was not interested in the girls that his older brother chose. At this time, the young prince was struggling with his illness in Alexandrita's bedroom. That day, he again received a miraculous healing in the church, but it had already begun to lose its power. He wondered if he really had no time left, because it seemed like the disease wouldn't take hold so quickly. All he could do now was occupy himself with memories that had made his life more interesting. He remembered the girl he met today, how spontaneously she behaved. She was sometimes scared, sometimes screaming, sometimes showing bewilderment. At the same time, it seemed that she was not just fooling around, that she had some kind of goal. Alexandrite thought that maybe at least at the ball he would be able to create one more good memory for the end. People of high position and social status were supposed to gather at this celebration. The nobles, desperate to preserve both the prestige and wealth of their families, exchanged the latest news, rumors, and even made important decisions. Among them were fateful ones that changed their entire lives. For example, the decision about marriages. During the ball, one could propose to the girl one liked. In principle, this was the case in the real world, but Arianel was still worried about the upcoming events. When the day came, she was decidedly unprepared. Still, there was anticipation in her, but she was floating in the clouds when Nydia brushed her hair. The other maids circled around her, helping her get ready and choose a dress. However, Arya understood that today would be the day when events would continue, and she would need to stay in the thick of it. In the book, this chapter was called The Ball of Destiny, the first major event that happens after Marine meets all the princes. In addition, Ariana remembered that after the saint communicated with the princes at the ball, the king would suddenly issue an important order. It states that she will have to choose one of the 3 principals to marry and rule the country together. There was something unfair about all the princes being handsome. However, it was still necessary to choose only one, and that one would become the next king. But there was something else going on here. If Alexandrite did not become the saint's fiancé, he would have no chance of surviving. If the main character chooses Onyx as her husband, as actually happened, then she will not treat Alexandrite. This means that Arianel needs to eliminate the second prince in order to allow Marin and Alex's relationship to develop. At last, the evening of the ball arrived, when the greater part of what was written in the book was to be decided. As she approached the imperial castle, she felt a certain amount of uncertainty, since she had absolutely no idea how to behave in society. The tables were richly decorated, and there were beautifully dressed guests around. She chose her own outfit, but Nadia was completely disappointed with it. She kept trying to force her to dress according to the rules established for young girls. However, Arianel was so stunning in her dress that she couldn't help but attract attention. At the same time, Nadia did not lose hope, and she took something more decent with her, all the while persuading her mistress to change clothes. And at times she was too loud. Arya was afraid that they would attract too much attention. So from time to time she cast angry glances at her maid, trying not to miss the course of events. However, she regularly distracted her, while Arya kept looking for Moraine. Her plan was to befriend her, and then gently guide her towards Alexandrite to distract her from his brother. However, she still couldn't see her in the crowd. There were too many guests. However, according to the plot of the book, this was Marin's first appearance in society after her debut. It was a very important event for her, something like a coming-of-age ceremony. All 15-year-old girls had to go through it, but Marin was especially so. She was trained to be a saint. Because she had such power, she was kept in the church so that she would not be used for harm. Therefore, she managed to maintain the purity and meekness that were so highly valued and gave her the opportunity to become a queen. In principle, few of the nobles met Marin, since after the coming-of-age ceremony she no longer attended balls. However, she had to come to this one, so it was so important to avoid meeting and developing sympathy for the other princes. Finally, Arianel smiled contentedly as she had found Marin. She was dressed in a beautiful dress appropriate to her age, gentle and beautiful. At the same time, she behaved modestly, distinguished by her thoughtfulness and special tenderness. Arya knew that other princes would appear, and as a villainous aristocrat she would need to ruthlessly hinder them. But she was absolutely ready for this role, so she gathered all her villainous powers. Marin didn't suspect anything and simply enjoyed the company. Although it must be said that Arya was delighted with the saint, she really was gentle, pure, and beautiful. Besides, Ariana was glad that she found her right away. Now all she had to do was eliminate everyone except her favorite. Standing next to her, she thought that it was time for the game to begin while she was fully armed. However, completely different men approached the main character, and Ariana immediately sent them back. She could not allow the saint and her powers to be handed over to unworthy suitors. Marin remembered that they had hardly communicated before, so she was surprised by her behavior. At some point, Arya felt unwell from the tension, and Marin immediately asked if everything was okay with her. Even though she replied that everything was fine, she offered to bring her a drink. At the ball, there was a chance that she might run into one of the other princes, and then the whole plan would come to an end. However, another unpleasant situation occurred as Marin collided with one of the ladies. This careless woman spilled wine on her, ruining her entire dress. Ariana thought that there was no such scene in the book. What to do in this situation, whether it even matters, was unclear. The careless woman threw an apology over her shoulder, mistaking Marin for a petty noblewoman who was hunting for men. At the same time, she looked down on her, not thinking that everything that happened was her fault. Marin was too soft to stand up for herself, but Ariana had a different character. Looking at the lady walking away, she suddenly thought that she would not leave this so easily. Ariana loudly asked her to stop, which she did rather reluctantly. At home, she cast a displeased glance over her shoulder and asked what she wanted. Ariana replied that she should ask for forgiveness for her actions. She noted that the phrase she casually dropped was not considered an apology. She said that there was no sincerity in her words. The lady replied that it did not concern her. Ariana broke away and asked if she wanted her to silently watch as someone dear to her was being offended. After that, she asked what family this girl was from. And then she said that she most likely knew that she had just poured water on the Duke's daughter, and she asked if she had really wanted to offend her with her behavior. What would her family say about this when they find out how ugly a representative of their family acted? She was so firm and convincing that the girl was genuinely embarrassed. After that, she bowed low and began to apologize for her inappropriate behavior to Marin. She was shocked by this and immediately said that she forgave her. The girl looked at Ariana and asked her if she was okay with such a request for forgiveness. She replied that this was enough, but noted that she should not do this in the future. Looking into the girl's eyes, she said that her ignorance would one day lead to her destruction. Such words shocked those who stood nearby and watched this scene. Ignoring them, Ariana told her to try to get a proper upbringing. The girl was completely taken aback, but she couldn't say anything in response. She was afraid of continuing this conversation and tried to bring it to an end, promising that she would try very hard. Arya was satisfied and then remembered why she was here. While she was busy with this insignificant lady, something irreparable happened. Marin was approached by Prince Onyx, who found her very attractive. In addition, the younger Prince Citrine also appeared, who was very handsome. Her favorite, blue-haired Alexandrite, for whom she had started this whole game, was also there. It was too unexpected, as the situation was almost out of control. She expected the princes to come someday, but she thought they would come one at a time. She rehearsed all night long and thought she was fully prepared, but she didn't expect all three to show up at the same time. And she had absolutely no idea what to do now. She had no plan for this case. All three introduced themselves in turn, and she noted that Alexandrite was incredibly handsome. However, since there was no such thing in the book, she stood in a stupor and did not know what she should do now. Ariana was torn between doubts, but a decision had to be made immediately. At this time, Onyx extended his hand, but not towards her. He was reaching for Marin. The middle prince asked if she was okay, seeing the mishap with her dress. The young saint replied that everything was fine, but she could not resist repeating his gesture. She extended her hand to him, which meant that the sympathy could already be mutual. Ariana wondered if she hadn't made it in time. Events were starting to unfold despite her efforts to resist them. So she couldn't think of anything better to do than grab Onyx's hand, which completely stunned him. At the same time, she grabbed her tightly, declaring that everything was fine with Mrs. Marin. After which, looking into his eyes and not letting go of his hand, she asked him not to worry. However, at that moment, Citrine intervened, asking in surprise how they could be okay, considering what was happening to their outfits. After that, he suggested that they change clothes. Ariana understood that Marine needed this, since her entire dress was covered in wine. At that moment, Ariana's maid Nadia was rushing towards her, still holding in her hands the dress she had tried to persuade her to wear. Then Ariana replied that if they needed a dress, they had it with them. There was nothing to worry about. However, at that moment, Alexandrite lifted her up, completely depriving her of any understanding of the situation. He picked her up in his arms, surprised Onyx, and she herself could not even ask questions. However, Alexandrite whispered in her ear that she should also go and change. This action brought her back to very recent memories, when her thoughts were still full of expectations of the beautiful and the unknown. As she pressed herself against him, she suddenly remembered herself in her past life, the one where she was still Asuka. And then she certainly could not have imagined that she would ever be lifted into the arms of a real prince. The world around her seemed to begin to collapse, and she again found herself as a nondescript teacher in rather boring glasses. Then, her personal life never worked out. She remained alone for the rest of her life after what happened in her childhood. This feeling did not leave her even when she grew up and began teaching children herself. The kids at school could be pretty cruel, and her classroom flashed before her eyes again. As if looking into the past, she saw her younger self, who walked around with short hair and nondescript clothes. She only had to look at one boy, and all her classmates started talking about her. She heard behind her how everyone pitied this poor boy whom she liked, and some even laughed and said that it was surprising that such a monster as her could like someone at all. These laughing voices sounded in her head, driving her crazy, making her feel ugly. Inside, she hid and thought that no one would ever love someone like her. So she silently begged and pleaded for them to stop, because she had no idea that anything could change. Tears flowed from her childish eyes, but she was firmly convinced that there would never be love in her life. Suddenly, she came back to reality, hearing a voice speaking to her and calling her by her new name. She sat up in bed, completely confused as to how she could have gotten there. Arya even decided that everything that happened before was just a dream. It was strange that even in her new form she dreamed of the times when she was unloved. She thought that she had forgotten about all this, thanks to her passion for her favorite hero, who became the meaning of her life. However, here she wondered where she was and why she was lying in bed in a ball gown. At that moment, someone brought her a glass of water, and it was none other than her beloved Alexandrite. After she drank all the water in one gulp and felt herself coming back to life, she heard the familiar voice again. She tried to make sense of what was happening, but she couldn't. The eldest prince of the empire sitting next to her asked her if she wanted more water, after which he handed her another filled glass, thinking that she needed to quench her thirst. Having finally woken up, Arianel realized that something incredible had happened. Alexandrite said that her face was red. It looked like she had a fever. Confused, Arianel tried to crawl away, as she didn't know what to do in such situations. However, the prince did not go anywhere, which made her already confused thoughts even worse. She closed her eyes tightly, feeling herself losing strength and falling, even though she was in bed. However, Alexandrite caught her, trying to prevent her from falling again, holding her carefully in his arms. Looking her straight in the eye, he asked if she had hurt herself, but she didn't even know what was happening to her. Arianel sat in shock, realizing that the inevitable was about to happen, which would disgrace her in front of her favorite. She asked him for forgiveness, after which she thought that she couldn't say that her nose was going to bleed because she felt the warmth of her body and the scent of her favorite hero. After which I tried with all my might to restrain the urges of my body, which was about to stage a real scene from a horror movie. She could have completely splattered him with blood from her nose. If that happened, she would have been on the direct road to hell. However, everything worked out. Nevertheless, she felt how he squeezed her hard from excitement. Arya asked him to free her hand a little. He lifted her up and said that it would be better for her to lie down a little longer to feel better. She knew he was too close. His skin was so perfect that she couldn't look at him without getting excited. Alex said that she suddenly lost consciousness in the ballroom, which is why she was brought here. He picked her up and went with her to one of the bedrooms to give her the opportunity to rest until she came to her senses. She remembered how she could smell his body even when she couldn't see anything with her eyes. She remembered how he carried her in his arms, how comfortably she lay on his shoulder. After this, she realized that she had forced her favorite, who was already sick, to carry her in his arms. Alex said he was very worried when she lost consciousness. He tried to look into her eyes to make sure nothing serious had happened. After that, he noted that you can't stress yourself out so much when you feel so bad. Alexandrite noticed that it seemed to him that she was in great pain, and this worried him. He told her to calm down a little. He would bring his attending physician. She understood that the catastrophe with the nosebleed was not yet completely irreversible, and she was very afraid of such an outcome. However, the prince looked at her in such a way that she tried with all her might to refrain from dirtying him. Although, when he put his hand to her cheek, the chances of that became less and less. The way he looked at her made her go a little crazy. She thought that she needed to distract herself with something, otherwise the catastrophe would be irreversible. At this moment, Citrine, the youngest prince of Pendragon, conveniently entered the room. He was incredibly handsome. All the ladies fell at his feet as soon as he looked at them. The younger prince walked slowly towards the bed where Arianel lay, being looked after by his brother Alexandrite. Looking at him, the count's daughter thought only about how to prevent her nosebleed from suddenly starting. After all, she had to end up in the body of such a sickly girl. Alexandrite courted her sweetly and caringly, but her indifference to the beauty of the third prince hurt Citrine. He had never seen such a cold look directed in her direction. Wherever he went, women adored him, but this girl did not react in any way. When he asked her why she was so indifferent, she replied that she was meditating. Citrine thought that there was definitely something wrong with this woman meditating when there was such a beautiful and powerful person in front of her was strange. Arianel hoped that her nosebleed wouldn't start. After all, embarrassing herself in front of two princes at once would be too much for one day. However, Citrine wondered what was wrong with her and why his older brother was so attracted to her. After all the women went crazy over him as soon as he appeared in society. Looking at her with an indifferent gaze again, Arianel realized that she had calmed down enough that a nosebleed could be avoided. It was clear to her why such a young girl had no suitors. She informed Alexandrite that she felt quite well, and he asked Citrine why he had come. Arianel was certainly not well, but Alexandrite did a great job of taking care of her. Then the younger brother turned to her and asked her a question that made her feel embarrassed. At first, she tried to say that he was quite handsome, to flatter his vanity. She also knew from the book that this was his most vulnerable spot because he considered himself the most beautiful of all. However, he asked who advised her to dress up like that. He said that she was still a member of the nobility. So why was she wearing such a tasteless dress? Arianel was shocked by such tactlessness, not knowing what to answer him. It was such a disrespectful behavior, like the kids in her class asking if she had a boyfriend and why she was so ugly. Citrine Pendragon was the third prince, only he was the son of the second queen. He had such a beautiful face that he could be mistaken for a girl. Once he even dressed up in women's clothing, although by nature he was a self-absorbed narcissist, so he could not become an object of adoration. Even in the book, she was not particularly interested in him, since he was almost the same age as her students. She understood that he needed to show some mature self-control, so she replied that she really liked the dress. The third prince remarked that he was sorry that such a woman did not listen to his good advice. Arya realized that it was his childish sarcasm that manifested itself so trivially, which is why she could not fall in love with him. At that moment, Nalia was already standing next to her, offering her to change into the dress that she considered more suitable. She had been fussing over him since the morning, demanding that Ariana look appropriate to her status. However, at this point, Alexandrite intervened and said that she looked good in this outfit. He noted that it does not look vulgar or overly bright, as Citrine called it. The younger prince was still trying to talk and convince the girl to change her clothes, as he was not used to being in the same room with people without taste. Alexandrite abandoned his position, noting that looks were not important, while Citrine wondered what his older brother could find in her at all. The nosebleed was about to start again as Arianel's anxiety level was rising. At that moment, the door opened, letting in new characters. Arianel was shocked to see Marine, who had already changed her clothes. She looked gorgeous in a lavender dress that fit her perfectly. It was even better than the previous one, and according to the description, it was the same one from the final scene of the book. Arianel was impressed. It was truly magnificent and worth the long description that came with it. She immediately rushed towards Marin, glad to have gotten out of this situation. She asked her how she felt, but Arya couldn't contain her emotions. She pinched her nose again as she imagined the scene where her favorite would hold Marin in that dress in his arms. It should have been him, but at that moment she heard another voice. It belonged to Prince Onyx Pendragon, who was the second brother and also a direct competitor of her favorite. When they stood together with Marin, it looked like the cover of a book. A handsome, tall, dark-haired man, he had some charm, but he only pretended to be a simpleton in order to get closer to Marin. At the same time, Alexandrite loved her with all his soul, but Onyx took advantage of her kindness, thereby showing his character as a real scoundrel. That's why Arianel hated Onyx with all her heart, because of whom her beloved hero had to die. By the way, at the first meeting, when he actually saved Marine, everything should have been different. The thing is that, according to the plot, he was Marin's childhood friend and loved her from the very first time they met. Oh, these childhood crushes. Everything works out for the heroes when they are still very young and nothing can be done about it. Arianel thought it was no surprise that they were left alone at the end of the book. However, then her favorite will die, and Marin will remain with this hated enemy. Arianel thought that now was only the beginning of the plot. There was still time to change everything. At this point, Marin thanked the prince for giving her the dress. He said he was glad to help her, and there was some kind of physical attraction between them. Arianel howled to herself. Did he really prepare a dress for her? Why were things developing so quickly? They looked at each other without taking their eyes off each other. Her favorite's chances were getting smaller and smaller. Something had to be done urgently. Otherwise, the worst outcome could not be avoided. Onyx looked at Marin with such loving eyes and treated her so carefully that it was even infuriating. At the same time, Marin reciprocated his feelings, not paying any attention to Alexandrite. Arianel howled again, but she realized that if she did nothing, he would not succeed. Now was not the time for any bleeding, as all possible chances were already slipping out of her hands. So she decided to take a firm decision and go all out. She decided to turn on the OTK mode, which meant killing in one move. At this time, they had already moved into the hall where the ball continued, and Onyx decided to invite Marin to dance. This means that the rapprochement between them will happen even faster. This simply could not be allowed. Arianel decided to intervene and said that it would be better if she stayed with the princess. Onyx looked at her with bewilderment. It would be strange to see two ladies dancing. However, Arianel reminded that some ladies had previously pestered Marine, and the presence of the prince next to her would make them even more jealous. In that case, many other unpleasant things could happen to her. Everyone looked at her with bewilderment, but she was in her own thoughts. At the same time, Marin was immensely grateful to her for her care. She was quite surprised by this, but she simply did not know about Arianel's insidious plans. She dreamed that her favorite would end up with the Holy Virgin, and that this would allow him to live. However, Alexandrite intervened and said that he was against it. He approached Arianel and said that she had just fainted, and that it might get worse at the ball. The first prince said that he would not allow her to participate in it, as he was worried about her well-being. At that moment, Arianel reminded herself that she was in OTC mode. She needed to turn it on full blast. However, the others supported his decision, worrying about the condition of Arya, who was known for her poor health. But she said that she felt great and really wanted to take part in the ball. She turned to Marin with a request, begging her to take her with her. The kind-hearted and gentle saint could not refuse, doubting what they could do in this situation. Then Alexandrite said that he had no choice but to agree with Arianel. However, he had one condition that had to be adhered to. He took her hand. Arianel shuddered at his touch. She still felt awkward in his company. She looked at him and waited for him to answer what condition he wanted to set. He kissed her hand, after which he said that he would agree to let Arianel take part in the entertainment. However, to do this, she must promise him that he will be her dance partner. At the same time, he looked into her eyes, waiting for her to answer. She didn't understand at all how it could have come to this, because she did everything to bring him together with Marin. He held her hand and remembered what had happened just recently, why his young life had to end soon. 6 months ago, when the pain had become almost constant, he had a conversation. The doctor who was supposed to look after him said that the disease had spread. He noted that the prince had at most a year left if the saint regularly provided him with help. This was unexpected, as the young man was confident that he could live longer. He asked the doctor if there was a possibility of a complete cure for this affliction, to which he received a negative answer. It can only be delayed somehow, but it is impossible to cure it completely. Sooner or later, the prince is in danger of death, since it is impossible to cope with his illness. Initially, it was just a mole on his leg. The prince thought it was just an injury. However, it then spread to the arms and shoulders, and the pain became almost unbearable. No one knows about his illness except the king, the attending physician, and the chief priest. Therefore, it was decided that Prince Onyx would become the next king. However, he was indignant that his brother was more worthy of this fate. He did not know that Alex was dying. It was decided to keep silent about this so as not to create panic in the state. But Onyx refused to learn the necessary arts, as he believed that he would not need it. Alexandrite tried to explain to him that he should learn government, politics, diplomacy. However, he stated that he was not going to be king. He had no need for such knowledge. He believed that Alexandrite should be the head of state, since he had highly developed morality, compassion. He was well educated and modest. However, it was not up to him to decide, but he did not know the real reason why his brother could not rule the country. Onyx wanted to become the perfect knight who would serve the perfect ruler. He was willing to fight for his brother to become ruler, not wanting to take his place. At the same time, he behaved quite violently. Everyone was afraid that he might do something inappropriate. When the king was talking to Alexandrite, he asked if perhaps he should tell his brothers about his illness. The king was seriously concerned about the behavior of his middle brother, but Alexandrite said that he could not tell. Telling his younger brothers that he would soon be leaving them was too difficult for him. They were dear to him, so he didn't want to put the premature pain of loss on them. The king noted that he agreed with Onyx's words that there was no better ruler than Alexandrite. However, he still answered his son that he would keep his secret, but if Onyx continued in the same spirit, they could have difficulties. Then Alexandrite suggested using a trick, using the saint in his plans, because Onyx had been in love with her since childhood. She is the perfect candidate for the future queen, endowed with the powers of a saint to whom Onyx showed great affection. If the king announces that the prince she chooses will become king, perhaps Onyx will be interested in it. Then there will be no need to force him, and the kingdom will be in safe hands. The king said that he would try to interest all participants in this, so he agreed with his eldest son. He told Alexandrite as he was leaving that he still hoped that they would find a way to cure him. He replied that there was practically no hope for this, but the king was not ready to resign himself. He repeated that he considered Alexandrita the most suitable candidate for the role of king. The son was grateful to him, but he did not want to stir up panic among the people, which would inevitably arise if they learned about his curse. So he was surprised when it turned out that the high priest had investigated and found some information. From ancient writings, it became known that a disease, which in fact turned out to be a curse, can be completely cured with the help of an extract of the librum flower. These writings were dated back 100 years, and it was not known whether they could be trusted. However, Alexandrite's brain clung to the last hope he wanted to live so much. If there was even a small chance to save himself, he had to take it. The priest then began an investigation to find this sacred flower. Only he could give Alexandrite a complete cure, but there was no success in this. Now he only had 6 months left, and at night he couldn't help but indulge in heavy thoughts. Was he really born into this world only to die from an unknown disease? For some time, the priests performed rituals that removed the power of the spell, and the disease became weaker. But it only slowed down and could not disappear completely, and the pain was almost all the time. Therefore, Alexandrite decided for himself that he wanted to live a happy life for now, the one he dreamed of, at least for the last few days. He wanted to feel joy and happiness, which he would soon be deprived of. At that moment, a bird that had flown above him dropped a feather as if it had flown in to save him from the shower. This feather seemed to divide his life into before and after, because something completely unexpected happened. He met a girl who at first was simply interesting to him, but then gradually became the meaning of his life. Spontaneous, strange, abrupt, she was completely different from the women he was used to. He just couldn't forget her expression when she first saw him. That reaction couldn't be faked. She opened her mouth, her eyes almost popped out of their sockets, and yet she remained very charming. Besides, she acted as if her purpose in life was to amuse him. When the servant was outraged by her behavior in front of the prince, he could not help but laugh. His servant was surprised by his reaction, but it caused completely different emotions in him. For the first time in a very long time, he really laughed and felt happy. After that, he went to see where this woman would go. She always seemed to him the most amazing, charming, and unusual. No one had made him laugh so much in a long time, and at such moments he forgot about his pain. And she never ceased to amaze him with her behavior, serving as a balm for his soul. He wanted to know who she was, so he rushed to look at the carriage in which she was leaving. Alex recognized the coat of arms of Count Foxknight, after which he realized that he simply had to see her again. Then he told his servant that he had one small request for him. He thought with a bad feeling that he most likely wouldn't like it. A ball was to be held soon by the royal family. Alexandrite sent his servant with an invitation for Arianel, who was also an aristocrat and had every right to be at this event. The prince was looking forward to that very evening. When the carriage bearing the Foxknight family crest finally arrived, he was already waiting. Standing by the window, he saw Arianel getting out of the carriage in a chic dress. It was too flashy, but it was in her style and suited her very well, given her unusualness. He was already anticipating how many interesting emotions he would be able to see on her face, and this made the pain recede. His premonitions did not fail him. He had never seen so many cute little faces before. She behaved in a manner completely uncharacteristic of other aristocrats, which both touched and amused him. He couldn't stop looking at her because she was so spontaneous and beautiful that he would like to spend the rest of his days next to her. Alex hoped that he could live the remaining 6 months experiencing laughter and joy next to this woman. She was unusual, but it was clear that she treated him well. She was nevertheless persuaded to change into another dress in the corridor he and his younger brother waited for her to come out. The door opened slightly. Alexandrite looked at it impatiently, afraid that she would lose her uniqueness and hoping that in her new image she would be just as beautiful. However, his expectations turned out to be much lower than what he saw. Even Citrine looked in surprise at Arianel, transformed into a delicate dress. Alexandrite was both amazed and in love, as this outfit suited her much better than a bright evening dress. She looked embarrassed, gentle, even seemed to become younger. Looking at her, Alexandrite understood that he didn't need anything else in this world. He asked God only for the opportunity to be near her, to touch her, to look at her. Then he will be able to leave peacefully, living out the rest of his time without regretting anything. He kissed her hand, inviting her to dance, during which he hoped to enjoy her wit. Looking at her, he anticipated how many more cute faces she would manage to whip up while they were at the ball. Arianel looked away shyly as he kissed her hand, the thought of her being so close to him making her shudder. However, she could no longer detach her finger from his, as this touch excited her. While dancing, she could smell his body. He smelled of flowers and exuded courage. She didn't understand what she had done to deserve such happiness in her life, and was ready to simply melt. At this time, Onyx took Marin to the center of the hall. Arianel began to worry, remembering her plan. The music had to change. The partners could be changed. She firmly decided that she would dance with Onyx. In order to create the best future for her beloved, she was willing to make sure he was with the woman who could save him. She will simply become a Cupid, an angel who will give him true love. Her fighting spirit was unshaken. She was confident that she could cope with her task. It was impossible to leave her idol to the mercy of fate. Every moment she was with him, she felt the happiest, but she had to remember her plans. He began to notice something as he asked her what she was worried about now, after which he asked her if she was so bored dancing with him that she looked around. Arya thought to herself that she didn't dare touch the deity with her sweaty hands. She needed to repay him somehow, so she couldn't allow herself to make him feel like she wasn't with him. She said that there was nothing more pleasant than being in his arms and dancing with him. However, as Cupid, she had the responsibility to ensure that he was reunited with Marin and lived. As they left for the ballroom, Citrine remained behind to watch them. He thought to himself that he had chosen this dress for her himself, and that was why she looked so good in it. Arianel remembered from the last chapter she had read, which she had bought on the black market before the book came out, that the most important thing was supposed to happen at the window. It was there that Alexandrite showed not only nobility but also courage towards Marin. He kissed her hand, which greatly increased the saint's sympathy towards him. So now, during the ball, it was necessary to make it so that he could invite her to the window. Then, according to her calculations, they will be able to reach the very last scene when they will be left alone. But before that, there was still a lot to do. Arianel had to make sure that Marin and Alexandrite danced together. However, Onyx interfered with these plans, as he had already taken Marin to the center of the hall. With such a crowd of people, it would be quite difficult to correct the situation, considering that everyone was admiring this beautiful couple. However, Arianel had 2 important reasons to want Marine to reunite with Alexandrite. Here, 2 situations had to coincide at once when they approached the window, and Alexandrite kissed her hand, and also if she rubbed her leg, he would lift her up in his arms. Arianel hadn't yet figured out how to make all this happen. Forcing Marin to walk more so that her leg would hurt seemed somehow inhumane. However, she needed to increase the chances that she would be able to appreciate Alexandrite and his feelings. Looking at the dancing couple, Arianel understood that she had no chance in this scene, but her favorite would remain alive. But he tried to get closer to her, constantly pressing her during the dances. She was afraid of losing her head, afraid that she would not be able to restrain herself and give free rein to her feelings, which could come flooding in at any moment. At the same time, she understood that she was not the main character here. She did not have the strength of a saint to help Alexandrite overcome the disease. She couldn't keep healing him all the time, prolonging his short life. However, he treated her so tenderly, holding her hand, kissing her, that it was very difficult to resist. Arya looked into his beautiful eyes, not understanding how this could happen to her. He kept spinning her around. She enjoyed these moments, because very soon she would have to start implementing her plan. These hugs would be very short-lived. All that was left was to remember them as they were. These touches of hands made her whole body tremble, and happiness spread through her veins. The beautiful sounds of music surrounding her as the dancing couples that she didn't pay attention to. At this time, Marin apparently was enjoying Onyx's embrace, but it did not last long. Knowing that the music was about to end, Arianel tried to enjoy it more. She knew that she didn't deserve it, that only Arianel's appearance helped her feel it in real life. At this time, one man, discontentedly sipping wine, tried to understand what went wrong. Surrounded by many beautiful ladies, Citrine sat and raged, watching as Arianel ignored him and was completely absorbed in his brother. He couldn't understand how this woman wasn't trying to fight for him, hearing other ladies nearby arguing among themselves about who would go dance with him next. Citrine sat with a displeased expression on his face, looking at Arianel. She didn't even try to hide the fact that she wasn't interested in the most handsome prince in the Empire. Now she seemed to him the most desirable woman he wanted to get. Even when she lay there pretending to meditate, she did not react in any way to his beauty. Despite the cries of the ladies around him who wanted his attention, he stood up and walked towards her. The decision was made. He would win this girl and make her fall in love with him. There was no way anyone could ignore his unearthly beauty, and even those who tried to stop him would not have been able to carry out their intentions. He knew that now peace was lost for him. It was important for him to get her. However, at that moment he heard a voice calling his name. It was his mother, Queen Opal of the Empire, who addressed her son. She asked him if it was time for him to choose a girl for the dance, to which he replied that he was just about to do so. Then she asked him where he was going, because he needed to choose the Duke's daughter. He asked why Marin, to which his mother replied that it was necessary so that he could become king. However, Citrine replied to his mother that he himself chooses with whom he dances. He did not say out loud that he was not going to become king, because he was not satisfied with such a life. At the same time, he noted that he was not interested in the Duke's daughter. He had already chosen a partner for himself. In addition, everyone knew that at the ball, the young princes had to choose suitable candidates for their wives. Citrine stated that he had already chosen a candidate for himself, and no one could decide for him in this matter. After that, he turned sharply and headed towards the dancing couples. Alexandrite and Arianel had just finished dancing. It was time to change partners. Arya thanked him, but her gaze was fixed on the other prince, whom she intended to distract immediately. It was Onyx. She wanted to dispel the spell that was between him and Marin to save her favorite. So she couldn't allow them to continue to cling to each other, increasing their infatuation. Just as she was heading towards him, something unexpected happened, some kind of plot error. At that moment, someone grabbed her hand. She tried to pull her hand away, but the grip became stronger. She heard Citrine's voice saying that he wanted to ask her to the next dance. Alex said that he was against it, but Citrine did not lag behind, noting that the music had ended, which meant it was time to change partners. Alexandrite was greatly outraged by his younger brother's behavior, but he saw that Arianel was also confused. The younger prince, accustomed to getting everything he wanted, asked Arianel for permission to invite her to the next dance. The three of them stood in the center of the hall, and Arya was confused. This was not in the plot. She didn't understand what she should do in such a situation, because the princes had to fight for Marin's heart. Her character was practically not present in the book, especially not at the decisive ball. The guys grappled with each other like a snake and a marten, and it was unclear who would win. Despite this, Arianel had her own plan. No matter how much she wanted to continue communicating with her idol, she knew that his life was more important. So now it was necessary to make a decision, but it was necessary to get out of the situation somehow beautifully. She stood there, trying to find the most polite words possible so as not to hurt her favorite's feelings, but also not to be rude to the younger prince. The task was not an easy one, especially since everything was changing at the speed of light and the plot developed faster than in the book. At that moment, she saw that the connection between Marin and Onyx was becoming stronger and stronger. They looked at each other like a couple in love. He had to make a decision urgently, otherwise the chance would be missed. Arianel tried to come up with the most suitable scheme as quickly as possible. Her mathematical mind was solving many equations in her head, trying to find the one that best suited the situation. She finally came to the right decision, after which she was able to exhale. Then she smiled sweetly. There was only a little left to do. She needed to put her emotions into beautiful words. Looking at the princes, she decided to turn to Citrine first. To do this, she chose the softest words and said that she was grateful for the attention, but she had already chosen her next gentleman for the dance. After that, leaving both princes perplexed, she headed towards the couple of Marin and Onyx. Showing all her irrepressible courage and even recklessness, she asked them to disperse. The couple, who already looked like they were in love, looked at her with bewilderment. However, Arianel did not lose her composure. She delivered her tirade in a loud and rather confident voice that did not tolerate objections. At first, she asked them to separate, as they were standing too close to each other, and their physical attraction was palpable. After which she declared that Prince Onyx was lucky. She chose him as her next dance partner. This time, everyone looked at her with bewilderment, including the prince and Marin, but the gentleness of the Duke's daughter did not allow her to resist. Arianel stated that she wanted to continue dancing with Prince Onyx if Marin didn't mind, to which she didn't know what to say. New music started playing. It was necessary to enter so as not to raise questions from those gathered. Arianel had already grabbed his hands, ready to show resistance, trying to warn him. According to the book's plot, she knew that Prince Onyx was noble and would not stir up a scandal. Everyone around was amazed by her behavior, as each of the girls dreamed of dancing with any of the princes. At first, Arianel thought that she would be very polite and pleasant, but the conversation went in a slightly different direction. Onyx was clearly extremely negative towards her, but apparently it wasn't about Marin at all. Arianel didn't understand this yet, so she tried to play the sweet role of just an overly intrusive person. However, he decided to go for broke and immediately asked what she did with his older brother. Arianel didn't expect this. She could believe that he could be indignant at her because of Moran, but not because of Alexandrite. She looked into his eyes and wanted to understand what was wrong with him, where she had made a mistake. However, he stated that she had bewitched Alexandrita. His brother is not one of those who are capable of choosing one single woman, but he does not lag behind her. Onyx said he had never seen his brother like this, his gaze becoming almost empty without her. He asked if Arianel was the black witch who had bewitched him, taking his soul. He had never treated any woman the way he treated her, and that was not the only reason for his indignation. He had never seen such a strange expression on his brother's face. He was sure that Arianel was driving him crazy, especially considering how much time he devotes to a person who is just an ordinary aristocrat. She is not even the daughter of a duke. So Onyx asked again if Arianel would admit that she was the black witch who had bewitched his brother. He looked at her so gloomily that she realized there was no joke in it. Arianel was so confused that she couldn't say a word, but she remembered what happened earlier in the story. Black magic was forbidden, but it still existed. Black priests did very terrible things. In doing so, they could send a curse that would destroy an entire nation. But the book also said that the current prince went to fight black magic, taking a saint as his ally. They were able to stop the attack because the saint completely compensated for the black magic. It was a very beautiful battle, where good defeated evil, which could not resist the light. Then Arianel decided to open up to Onyx, who so zealously defended his older brother. She told him that she completely agreed with him, and her main goal was to make Alexandrite the king of the empire. Arya added that he would rule together with his queen. And this means that she will direct all her efforts to ensure that Alexandrite is with Marin, the only woman who is worthy of him. After that, she invited Onyx to look in the direction where they were standing, so that he would understand that they were made for each other. At this time, Alexandrite and Marin stood looking at the dancing couple, but did not join in the dance themselves. They looked very harmonious, considering that there were no feelings of love between them yet. Arianel turned to Onyx and said that all she wanted was for Alexandrite to have the best woman. And in this case, she did not speak about herself. She believed that only the Duke's daughter, who was a saint, was worthy of him. At that moment, Onyx's heart sank. He understood that he had to part with his beloved so that his brother would be happy. Seeing his upset face, Arianel was overcome by the feeling of guilt that lay on her like a huge stone. However, she still said that it would be better for him to stay away from Marine, so as not to deprive his brother of happiness. The dance ended, everyone thanked each other, Arianel did the same, and Onyx automatically repeated her bow. It seemed that everything was decided, but at that moment something unexpected happened. The king entered the hall, demanding silence with his queen next to him. Arianel realized that this was an important event, after which everything would change. Despite the fact that the plot was a little crooked, the main lines remained unchanged. The emperor of the country demanded that everyone be silent, after which he made a speech. He said that despite the premature developments, the duke's daughter would now have to decide who would become king. Marin had to choose one of 3 princes whom she would marry and rule with. After this, he said that the young saint had time to make a decision, but it was limited. She had to choose between 3 handsome princes to whom she would give her heart would rule the country. Marin was not prepared for such a turn of events. She stood in the middle of the hall, stunned. Arya at this time thought that events were developing too quickly. It shouldn't have been like this. Was the most important thing about to happen now, because at that moment Marin's heart still belonged to Onyx. Alex simply hadn't managed to win it. Although, to be honest, he didn't even try, paying attention exclusively to Arianel. At that moment, Alexandrite raised his hand and said that he refused to be king. This shocked Arya, who was sure that no one could rule and govern this country better than him. It was also strange that the Emperor said that if this was so, then one of the other brothers should become king. Arya could believe it. It was really that simple. The king needed to demand that Alexandrite take on this duty. However, at this point, Citrine declared that he too was renouncing his rule. After he said that it was too much trouble, the king declared that Onyx would then have to become king. Arya couldn't believe it. Well, state affairs aren't decided that way, so they just decided that the son who didn't refuse would rule the country. She couldn't believe what was happening because she wanted to make Alexandrite king. However, he stubbornly refused, but it was impossible not to notice how sad his gaze became. Then he came up and said that he would take Arianel from Onyx as he had other plans. She didn't know what to answer. State affairs didn't concern her directly, so she couldn't express her opinion. The king made a decision, after which he announced that the saint would then become Onyx's wife, and he would become king. All those present were amazed, as they were sure that Alexandrite should become king. At this time, he took Arya by the hand, they left the ballroom and headed into the garden. It was a quiet summer evening. It was warm, the full moon was shining. They walked down long corridors. Arianel didn't know whether to start a conversation. However, she still asked why the prince refused to surrender to the king, since he had all the qualities for this. But he seemed to have something in mind. Still holding her hand, he said that he had another plan. Even though he had been preparing to be king all his life, circumstances had now changed. And then he looked slyly into her eyes and said that he wanted her to give herself to him for this evening. He needed to be with her, so he wanted her not to leave. Arianel didn't know how to react. This was her favorite idol, for whom she was ready to do anything. However, she realized that he, even though he was used to hiding the manifestation of his illness, felt worse. As he leaned against her, she felt movements in her chest that caused strong emotions in her. However, at that moment she realized that it was not just fatigue. Most likely the prince was showing signs of illness. Alexandrite was simply used to hiding everything from others, and according to the plot she knew that only a few were in the know. He was getting worse and worse, and she said that she would run to get a doctor to help him. However, he grabbed her hand and asked her to stay. He told her so sweetly not to go that she couldn't resist. There was a pleading look in his eyes. She understood that he was in hellish pain, but she didn't want to leave him alone. She told him that she would bring the saint here to help him, but he stopped her. As a result, he sat leaning against her for some time, then suddenly said that he probably scared her. Arya looked at him. The word made him feel better, although it was surprising because there was no divine power in her. However, he said that he had already let go, and it was clear from his appearance that the danger had passed. According to the plot of the novel, it was at this moment that he was healed by Marin, with whom they then went on a journey to find the magic flower. During it, they became closer, because spending the night at inns forces people to be closer to each other. Then they realized that they were feeling more than they wanted to, and that's when they opened up about their feelings. Arianel was so hopeful that this would all come true because she had done so much for it. However, at that moment the prince pulled away from her and said that he did not want to embarrass her, that he was simply tired. Arya was shocked because she was not a saint, she could not heal, but he really got better, although according to the plot, Marin was with him at that moment. It was not far from a nosebleed, as this upset her very much. She asked why he didn't want to become king, because there simply wouldn't be a better candidate, a kinder one to the people. Alcus said that he had been preparing to be a ruler all his life, but now, with her by his side, he realized that he could live without it. It was so strange for Arianel because she had no healing power, but he still felt better. Just touching her fingers a little, she felt her body being filled with sacred, beautiful energy. Sitting next to her, he said that he could live without ruling if she were with you. But Arianel thought that these were words he shouldn't have said to her. He should have said them to Marine. Then they would live happily ever after. She could heal him with her power at any moment, and he would stay alive. She asked him not to say such words to her, to think again in order to remain king. After all, he still had a chance to become Marin's husband, and this was an important condition for becoming a ruler. However, he replied that his brother Onyx was fully worthy of this fate. Arya asked if it wouldn't be better to return to the ball now, since there was still time for dancing. Alexandrite replied that he wanted to stay with her a little longer. He missed communicating with her. Moreover, he added that even if she refused, he would not accept it. Arianelle's eyes widened. She didn't expect such a turn of events. However, he touched her hand and said that even if she refused, he would not let her go. At that moment, she miraculously didn't die from the sweetness of what was happening, because she had never heard such words. The evening was still quiet and gentle, but at that moment it seemed to become even more beautiful. The smell of flowers became sweeter. The moon shone brighter as she held her pet's arm and walked with him through the park. She knew she needed to bring him to the ball to increase her chances of a relationship with Marin. However, at that moment he asked her if he could confess something to her. She immediately agreed, after which he began his story. Alex said that he had been preparing to become king all his life, but now he had to give it up, although he could not give a reason. He noted that he simply had no right to strive for the throne any longer. At some point, everything had changed. Arya realized that it was all about the disease. She would like to immediately find this flower that would cure him. However, to do this, she had to go on a journey, but she did not dare to say so. His courage and ability to look good even in difficult situations always supported her when she was a teacher. Looking at the poster of him that was published on the book's official fan site, she was able to move on with her life. She could have continued working as a teacher and not blamed her fate for her failures. He loved his people so much that he did not allow himself to burden them in any way, even with the knowledge of his illness. Alex always held up well, giving her the strength to remain courageous and determined. She could act like that in class even when she felt bad because she had support. And now she didn't want him to lose her because he was so important not only to her. She understood that he was losing a lot, but it was important not only for him. Arianelle asked if his right didn't matter, to which he repeated that Onyx was well suited to be the future king. He noted that he is often misunderstood because of his laconic facial expressions, but he is a very reliable person. He was serious, never backing down from his decisions, to which Arianelle thought to herself that this did not mean that he was suitable for the role of the next king. However, Alexandrite objected and said that one miracle was enough for a lifetime. He already received his miracle, he didn't even hope that it would happen, but now he is right next to it. And it warmed his heart, making him realize that life was magical. Arianelle looked up at him, realizing that it was a miracle he had named her, that his happiness lay in her. However, he continued, and said that the fact that she appeared before him was worth a lot. It's amazing, but when he talks to her like that, it seems to him that he can accept the path without the crown. This is probably the only thing he is allowed to do in this life. He leaned towards her again. She was pleased that he was constantly touching her. Even with his gloved hand, he constantly touched her hair, her face, as if he wanted to capture everything. However, then she came to her senses and asked what he was saying, because it couldn't be that he had resigned himself. But looking into his eyes, she understood that he had accepted his fate, but he still had his miracle. Although it was also a miracle that she came into this world to save it from the abyss. Arya thought it was unfair that he called her a miracle, because she was not Marin, she did not have the powers of a saint. However, he touched her so tenderly that she became more and more confident that she would do everything in her power. She will make him king no matter what. She will find Libram and get him the love of a saint. She told him out loud that she would do everything possible to ensure that he became the real ruler of the country. In fact, she had an ace in the hole, as she had read the novel cover to cover and downloaded it onto her phone. Another advantage was that she knew all possible events and their development, so she could influence them. He stopped her, objecting that thanks to her, he had already received the most important miracle in his life. And now it was enough for him that she was next to him. Now he could easily give up the title, forgetting everything he had been taught in his previous life. Arianelle said they needed a plan urgently, otherwise something irreparable might happen. She remembered that in the book, Marin was sent to the royal castle to learn how to be a real ruler and communicate with princes. This meant that she needed to hit him, but then she heard an unexpected scream. Even before she turned around, she realized that this was her servant, who had special ways of protecting her. Waiting for the inevitable, Arianelle turned around, asking Nadia not to do anything eccentric. However, at that moment, she saw that it was not only Nadia who had come. They were surrounded by the remaining princes and the saint. Marin led the two princes as they set out to find Arianel. It turns out that right at the ball, it was noted that Arianel had disappeared somewhere. Citrine was wondering if she had been seen. Onyx noted that only recently she had danced with their older brother, but after that they had not paid attention to what was happening. The younger one realized that this was the very girl whom their older brother Alexandrite had personally invited. Marin said that indeed Arianel had disappeared from sight long ago. She even began to worry that something bad had happened to her, knowing about her poor health. However, the two princes assumed that she was up to something. Moreover, the more she was interested in Alexandrite, the more Citrine was interested in her. He understood that his older brother spent too much time with her, but he couldn't understand what was so special about her. But he still hasn't given up on his desire to win her heart. Onyx asked Citrine if he knew what Arianel was planning, but he replied in the negative. It was strange for Marine to be present at this conversation, since she treated all people well and could not suspect anything bad. However, her brothers believed that she was not as simple as she would like to think. At that moment, a maid approached them and asked if they knew where her mistress was now. After that, they all went together to look for her and found her in the garden with Alexandrite. Nadia, as always, expressed her emotions violently, glad that her mistress was okay. However, she couldn't help herself and hugged her tightly, almost taking the breath out of her again. She said it was time for them to leave, but Arianel had one more unfinished business. She was also embarrassed by the fact that she was being controlled by a maid who literally carried her in her arms. With incredible willpower, she managed to break free from her embrace and turned to Marin with a request. She asked her if she would allow her to be her servant to help her. Arianel could serve since Marin was much higher in status, and she herself was only the daughter of a count. She said that she would do everything possible to help the saint cope with all her responsibilities and would support her in any difficulties. Marin, stunned by such a proposal, nevertheless agreed. A few days later, Arianel came to the palace, very happy that she had managed to get in there. She greeted Marin and said that she was very happy to carry out all her orders and help her. Marin replied sheepishly that she had been ordered to live in the royal palace, but she did not know what she was supposed to do. The only thing they told her was that she had to learn to behave like a future queen. However, she still did not understand what her duties were and was very confused. Arianel promised that she would help her cope with everything, considering that it was quite difficult for her to take up this position. She had to go through Nadia, who was not ready to let her go to the royal palace. However, Arianel resorted to one trick, knowing the servant's great love for her mistress. She managed to defeat her by declaring that if she was not released, she would never speak to her again. In this way, she managed to legally enter the palace in order to be able to introduce her favorite to the saint. However, she still didn't understand what would happen next. A lot of things were out of the plot. Marin was worried about how she would learn her new duties. Arianel tried to cheer her up in any way she could. There was such warmth coming from her that Marin could not even imagine that anything bad could be expected. At the same time, Arianel herself swore that she would do everything possible to make her mistress's life happy. The words were truly spoken sincerely, so Marin was glad that she had a companion in this difficult matter. At that moment, there was a knock on the door, followed by a commanding, firm female voice. It was a teacher who was supposed to teach Marin the intricacies of life as a queen. The lesson was supposed to start right now, which the teacher informed the girls about. When asked if she was ready, Arianel immediately answered yes, although it was asked to Marin. The teacher asked why there was a maid in the room, but Arianel shamelessly stated that she and Marin were one. She replied that since that was the case, she could attend classes. However, Arianel had completely different plans, and lessons were not included in them. Having discouraged both women, she declared that she had urgent business to attend to and turned to leave. Marin, already happy that she would have support, was a little shocked. And Arianel turned around, declaring that she would do everything for the well-being of the saint, for which she needed to leave. No one contradicted her, since she was already on her way out, and the presence of a maid during training was not necessary. Arianel, however, ran towards the castle as fast as she could, as she remembered how events should develop further if one believed the plot of the novel. As far as she remembered, during the breaks the heroes communicated with each other, and during this time a connection was established between them. So, Alexandrite and Marin had a few wonderful breaks between classes, but today something different was about to happen. So Arianel ran with all her might towards the place where the princes were practicing fencing. It was there that the events that would firmly unite the bond between Onyx and Marin were to take place. A sword that accidentally flies out will injure Onyx, and the saint will come to his aid to heal him. Nothing special was happening yet, but there was only Onyx in the class, who was studying with the other students. Arianel took up an observation position to see when events would begin to change. She knew she had to prevent Onyx and Marin from becoming more attached at any cost. Otherwise, everything will go as in the book's plot, and this will inevitably lead to an increase in their attachment. Then it is almost guaranteed that the saint will choose the middle brother. And this could not be allowed to happen, so Arianel was ready to sacrifice even her life. She watched what was happening on the court, unaware that she was being watched too. At this time, Alexandrite saw her hiding behind a column, not understanding what she was going to do. However, he understood that she had appeared here for a reason, but then another character appeared. He did not reveal his presence in any way, as he had his own plans. Following Arianel into the hall came Prince Citrine, whom she had not expected at all. While events were not developing yet, the younger brother decided that he would watch the Count's daughter for a while. Alexandrite saw that Citrine had also appeared in the hall, so he expected something interesting to happen. However, he felt like he wouldn't like it, since it was clear that Arianel was keeping an eye on Onyx. At this time, Citrine thought that Arianel was interested in the middle brother. He still couldn't figure out who exactly her target was, but it was certain that he had one target. Therefore, the two brothers, the elder and the younger, without consulting each other, decided that the situation could not be left to its own devices and should be monitored. Arianel looked back at the story to see where she could make adjustments. In fact, at the moment, the middle brother, whom she called a scumbag in her head, was simply training with the other students. In the story, during the fight, Onyx was supposed to be injured by another student. One of the main participants in these events was supposed to be a very young man who was training nearby. He practiced his strokes not with other students, but on a balance beam. But during his studies, something unexpected happened. The sword slipped from his hands and flew upward. He spun around and could have hit one of the students when he fell, but Onyx noticed him and pushed his opponent away, taking the blow himself. At this point, Arianel had already decided what she would need to do to avoid this situation. She will simply eliminate this young man by persuading him to move away. To achieve this, she was ready to use any tricks, so she approached him and turned to him, smiling sweetly. She looked beautiful, her pink hair braided, and she exuded confidence. Trying not to waste a minute, she called upon all her charm to capture the attention of this young man. She asked him to spare her a minute and asked if he could help her. The young man was somewhat taken aback by her offer, but he could not refuse her. He said that he would do it with pleasure, even without knowing yet what she was ready to ask him for. As a former teacher, Arianel was uncomfortable using the tricks she had learned from her students. However, she knew that if a teacher was good with himself, he would not be refused anything. It was unpleasant to use it against the boy, but she had no other choice at the moment. She tried to lead him as far away as possible, and he obediently followed her without asking any unnecessary questions. However, at that moment, Citrine appeared, blocked her path, and asked where they were going. The young man stood rooted to the spot, but Arianel insisted that they needed to leave, but Citrine did not lag behind. He asked her a direct question that she could not answer, but she understood that if the young man stayed, tragedy could not be avoided. However, she remembered that she was talking to the prince of this empire, albeit the youngest, and the young man could not refuse him. Looking straight at him, Citrine declared that he needed to go back, and his gaze was terrifying. He was confused and, having muttered the words necessary for submission, immediately returned to his studies. Arya tried to hold him back, but it was no longer possible. Citrine had ruined all the plans. She was about to leave herself, but at that moment the younger prince grabbed her hand. He asked where she was going now, but she asked him to let her go, but it didn't work. He asked her what she was planning and why she wanted to take this young man away, but at that moment, the events she feared began to unfold. The younger prince still held her hand, but Arianel heard the sword whistle through the air. At first it was quite quiet, but with each passing second, it grew louder. She realized that events had begun to unfold despite her interventions. However, for some reason the sword hung in the air, as if it had slowed down. The others didn't pay attention to it, but it seemed to Arianel that someone had used magical power to stop time. The book said that a saint could have done it, but she was nowhere to be seen at the moment. Onyx stood motionless at this time, although he needed to run so that the sword would not hit him. Arianel didn't understand what was happening. She tried to look around to find Marine. According to the plot, only she had the power to control time, but at the moment she was not there. Then she simply pulled her hand away from Citrine, rushing to save Onyx to prevent the threat. She knew that she was risking her life now, but it didn't matter now since there was so much at stake. The sword was still in the air, Onyx still didn't move. Arianel was rushing to save him. She managed to do it in time, as she pushed him away at the very moment when it was supposed to hit him. At that moment, everyone seemed to wake up from sleep. Screams began. The sword flew straight along its trajectory. It was reflected in her eyes. She saved Onyx, but put herself at risk. A little more, and the inevitable was about to happen. Asuka's second life was about to end so ingloriously. She looked at him as if spellbound, unable to move, understanding the numbness that the second prince had previously experienced. However, at that moment the clanking of weapons was heard, and the sword bounced far to the side. She escaped death, but she still didn't understand how, since she hadn't yet come out of her stupor. At that moment, someone grabbed her from behind, and Alexandrite appeared on the platform. It was he who threw away the sword that was supposed to hit Onyx first and then her. At that moment, he looked around at those around him, silently assessing the situation. His gaze was cold, but he managed to cope with the situation because he was more experienced and older. He told his brother to be careful and not to put himself in such danger. After that, he lowered his eyes and looked at Arianel. Onyx was scared and upset at the same time. He replied that he would be more careful in the future. At that moment, Citrine said that they were doing great. He was the one who caught Arianel when the sword was flying at her. Alexandrite extended his hand to help her up, then asked what she meant by that. He said it was unwise of her to throw herself in front of a flying dagger, but she didn't know what to say. She tried to formulate words, but the shock of the incident had not yet passed. Here Citrine intervened, asking if he couldn't see that she was already too scared, after which he repeated that they were coping quite well and did not need Alexandrite's help. He looked at him and said that he could have been quicker to avoid such complications. Citrine replied that he did everything he could. The sword shouldn't have hit Arianel, since he pulled her away. There was tension between the brothers that was visible to the naked eye. Arianel began to come to her senses, but at that moment, another participant in the events appeared. Marin ran towards her, extremely concerned about what was happening. Indeed, it was she who slowed down time, but it took her a little longer to get down to the fencing hall. She asked if Arianel really had feelings for Onyx, since she rushed to save him at the cost of her life. Not yet understanding what was happening, Arianel was very glad that her favorite and the saint were in the same place. She thought that this would help to create sympathy between them, but things turned out differently. Marin turned to her and asked if she was in love with Onyx. It was a completely unexpected question, since all her efforts were aimed at preventing the connection between the saint and Onyx. But she was misunderstood again, which reminded her of what happened in her first life, in her youth. There are two ways: either someone helps your love, or you help someone else's. In her past life, Asuka was the one who helped the stranger, and the girls turned to her somehow. One of them asked if she could talk to her neighbor to set her up on a date. At the same time, Asuka herself was also in love with this boy, but she did not dare to refuse. She also had a terrible experience as a child with a crush on a boy, which made her unwilling to repeat it. The girls simply asked her to arrange a meeting for them so that they could reunite. At the same time, they said that they were friends with her, although they had never even communicated before. Asuka decided to agree because she herself had no chance. All she had to do was arrange a meeting with her neighbors so that they could see this girl at a certain place. However, she was lucky, and after that, she made friends. They started inviting her to go shopping and for walks together. She started to always give away the guys she liked, remaining just a friend. At the same time, she believed that she found happiness in this, that she too was winning here. She had 100 photos of couples in love, but not a single one of her with a guy. And now everything was repeating itself. She was ready to give up her favorite, if only he would be happy, and getting into this particular romance was natural for her. However, after Marin's question, everyone froze, including Onyx himself. The younger brother was also shocked, as he was convinced that everyone falls in love with him first. Even less expected, this was Alexandrite, who had a special relationship with Arianel. She realized that it would not be possible to resolve the situation now, so she decided to ask the saint to have tea together. At the same time, she decided not to answer anything for now, since there were too many witnesses nearby. When they returned to the castle, delicious treats were already waiting for them on the table. Arianel understood that there was no way to avoid the conversation now, so she tried to find her words. Looking at her sadly, Marin brought up the issue again, asking if Arianel was really in love with Onyx. After all, she ran so bravely to save him, the saint was sure that she would not have dared to do such a thing. Arianel decided to calm her down and stated that she shouldn't do that. She has other tasks in this state, so she cannot be reckless. Then Marin said that she didn't want to hide anything, so she had to say that she had feelings for Prince Onyx. She said outright that she wanted to be with him because she felt in love with him. Beautiful eyes Arianel didn't understand when they managed to develop affection to such an extent. Then she decided that most likely it happened at the ball, while Arianel herself was with Alexandrite. It was then that she lost the ability to control the situation, which led to the emergence of love between the two. Indeed, while dancing, it is easy to develop feelings that were already in their infancy. Arianel realized that if everything remained as it was, her favorite would die. She would not be able to do anything more. But since Marin told her so directly that she had feelings for Onyx, it means that they could also answer her. She decided that this was the best way out of the situation now, and that it would help to stop the development of events a little. So she told Marin that she also had feelings for the middle prince. Seeing how sad the saint was, Arianel was no less upset than she was, but there was no way out. When Marin asked her again what they should do then, Arianel made up her mind and went for broke. She said that the saint should be with Alexandrite because there is no one more reliable than him. Besides, she thought to herself that otherwise Alexandrite would simply die. She would lose him forever. She seemed so upset that Marin began to console her and wipe away her tears. Arianel understood that she was not able to stop now, since the thought of her favorite's death was unbearable for her. She needed to go somewhere to think about the situation. She needed peace. Therefore, she first asked the saint for forgiveness for causing her pain. Then she said that she was ready to give everything for Mr. Onyx, which she proved today. She stated that she was ready to part with her life for him, so the saint had better make another choice. Marin looked at her in bewilderment because she was convinced that her feelings with Onyx were mutual. However, Arianel turned around and ran out, saying that she couldn't lose Onyx, that her feelings were too strong. Knowing the kindness of the saint, she was convinced that she would do everything to help her, but she couldn't stay next to her after such a confession, so she turned around and said that she would be back for dinner, after which she added that she shouldn't fire her and rushed ahead to be alone. Marin was left alone, but she immediately heard someone calling out. The voice was familiar. It belonged to the third prince of the state of Citrian. When she turned around, he smiled politely at her and said that he could help her, after which he asked if she really had feelings for his middle brother. Marin answered in the affirmative, after which Citrin asked permission to express his opinion on this matter. He told her that his brother also had strong feelings for her, so that she would not dare to refuse him. Otherwise, she will make him unhappy for life and will not be able to find legitimate happiness herself. At that moment, Arianel ran as fast as she could towards the park to be alone. She didn't expect to see anyone. She just needed some silence and time to think about what was happening. Now the situation is exactly like in her youth and in another life, when she was simply ready to give her favorite to another girl. But this didn't mean that she herself didn't want to be with him. It was just necessary and right now. She thought it would be a good idea to arrange a meeting between Alexandrite and the saint somewhere outside the castle so that they could get closer. Walking along in thought, she did not notice how someone else appeared in the park. It was Alexandrite, who greeted her joyfully and asked permission to ask her a question. He said that he was already about to head in her direction. He was glad that she came herself. After which he asked if she was really in love with his brother Onyx, as Marin suggested. Arianel was shocked by this question. She didn't think anyone would pay attention to it. However, Alexandrite asked again if she really preferred his middle brother, after which he said that he was ready to come to terms with this, but did not understand why Onyx in particular. After all, it seemed to him that they had a special connection, and Arianel wondered if he had really heard the conversation with Marin. After all, then it turns out that she upset her favorite, who was now looking so sadly into her eyes. She didn't want to be the cause of his upset, but she didn't know how to change that. Not knowing what to say to him, she asked for forgiveness, saying that she had not meant to upset him in any way. The evening was warm, the moon was round, and Alexandrite began his conversation, which was of great importance in understanding his feelings. There were 3 sons in the emperor's family. Alexandrite was the eldest, Onyx was born after him, and the youngest was Citrine. At the same time, Alex always treated his brothers well. As there was a special bond between them, they spent a lot of time together. Being the scariest, he took care of them, showed them how to cope with their lessons properly. But most of all, he loved Onyx, who walked clinging to him. He always asked to study with him. His love was real and sincere. Alexandrite loved him no less, as they had been very close since childhood. So when Arianel saved Onyx with such passion, Alexandrite thought that maybe she had feelings for him that he hadn't noticed. Arianel realized that the whole situation was getting out of control. She simply couldn't change anything. She remembered how when they were all standing together, Marin said that Arya was ready to sacrifice her life for Onyx. However, this news upset Alexandrite, who believed that Arianel was his personal miracle. He didn't want to lose her. She was more than just a girl to her. That's why it hurt him so much. Arianel realized that she had truly upset the already sick prince. She cried out that she didn't want him to be sad because everything she did was solely for his sake. Alex looked at her and couldn't understand how her falling in love with Onyx made him happier. Silently looking into his eyes, Arianel cursed herself for not being able to confess to him and tell him everything. However, he misunderstood her silence and then said that he did not want to interfere with her happiness. She immediately interrupted him and began to loudly ask for forgiveness again. After that, she said that she would do everything for his happiness. She would do everything so that he and Marin would be together. Arianel said that she was ready to give her life so that he could become king. He tried to weakly resist, but she told him to wait a little longer and she would sort everything out in his life. After which she ran away. Alexandrite remained standing, looking after her in confusion. Then he heard his younger brother tell him that she was a rather strange girl. Alexandrite didn't notice him appear, but the last thing he wanted to do now was talk to him. However, he needed to know if everything they had planned had worked out. Citrine replied that everything went smoothly. Marine was glad to know that the middle prince was in love with her. He managed to convince her that they would be happy together and that there was no point in retreating. He also noted that he had a conversation with Onyx as well. He was able to convince him that he shouldn't abandon Marin, but in return he wanted a favor from Alexandrite. Since he had helped him, he wanted him to abandon Arianel, whom he did not understand at all. This girl was too complicated, but at that moment Alexandrite extended his hand towards the moonlight, after which he said that he couldn't help but reach out to her light. She was too important to him. Citrine replied that in any case he would fight for her heart and make her love him. The elder brother said that he was not ready to fight Citrine, but he was not ready to retreat either. He knew he didn't have much time left, so he wanted to spend that time experiencing the happiness she gave him. However, looking at his brother, he understood that he was unable to articulate the reasons for such behavior now. All he could do was remain silent, hoping that the disease would not progress too quickly and that he had a little more time. However, as the pain intensified, he realized that he had very little time left. Arya knew that she shouldn't sit at the table with her mistress, but Marin strongly persuaded her. There was no way she could resist this sweet girl who truly deserved to be the main character. Even the food tasted better next to her. It was very pleasant to be around her. She hoped that Marin would not bring up the conversation that had happened earlier. However, to her surprise, she said that she would like to go into town on the weekend with Arianel. The saint would like to go for a walk to unwind, spend time together and buy the necessary things in the store. Arianel was delighted with the idea, especially since the city offered more chances to unite Marin and Alexandrite. While happily tucking into her lunch, Arianel was already thinking about how they would spend this weekend. Firstly, she really loved being around Marin. The saint truly emitted amazing energy. Marin was delighted with how enthusiastically Arianel accepted her proposal, and she was already making plans in her head about how she would arrange a date between Alexandrita and Marine. If you bring them to the fountain, it is quite possible that the connection between them will be strengthened. And if you're lucky and the feelings flare up so much that they cross all possible boundaries, a kiss will happen. So Arianel decided that she needed to talk to Harry, Alexandrite's assistant, to ask him to accompany the saint to the city. She immediately reported this to Marin, after which she anticipated the script would change thanks to her intervention. However, when the right day came and they went out into the city, she was discouraged. And the saint joyfully greeted Prince Onyx, who was heading straight towards them. He said he would be happy to accompany the saint on a walk into the city, but Arianel was furious. It wasn't supposed to be like this at all. Alexandrite should have been in his place. Had Harry really let her down? However, at that moment, the younger Prince Citrine appeared next to her. When asked how he knew they were going to town, he replied that she herself told Harry about it. However, Alexandrite's assistant said that the first prince could not leave the castle due to the large number of state affairs. Arianel thought, indeed, he had not been seen for several days, which meant he was too busy. The presence of state affairs explained everything, but now the whole walk lost its meaning. Citrine told Arianel not to worry, he would keep them company. However, she no longer saw the point in the walk, since all her plans were connected with Alexandrite. She even suggested going back, but everyone insisted that they go for a walk. As a result, it was necessary to leave the castle to go to the city, but Arianel was far from in a good mood. She tried to show it clearly, but the saint was in a good mood that could not be spoiled. She also reminded that Arianel herself wanted to go to the city, so it was worth going there. For Arianel, it was a complete nightmare. The whole day was ruined, as all her plans simply collapsed. However, at that moment, Onyx began to loudly call out to the others that it was time to go. Arianel wanted to refuse, but she couldn't leave these two without them doing something unnecessary. Citrine called Arianel and said that it was time to set off. The carriage would not wait forever. He hugged her and said that they would have a fun time, that the four of them would really be good. She had no choice but to follow him into the carriage. There were no options. However, she asked Citrine not to grab her hand at every opportunity, to which he only laughed. However, Arianel suddenly imagined that if these two headed towards the fountain, a kiss would happen between them, then absolutely everything would be lost. She sat in the carriage and sulked, spoiling everyone's mood, but they were on their own wavelength. It was clear that they were absolutely happy, despite the fact that they were not alone. Arianel kept trying to persuade them to go back, saying that the wind was too strong or that it was going to rain. She was angry and couldn't calm down, but nothing could be changed. She had to accept it. At this moment, important events were taking place in Prince Alexandrite's bedroom. The pain became so intense that it was no longer bearable. The disease had progressed too rapidly. Alexandrite could not get out of bed. The illness took all his strength. In a short time, she reached the heart, which meant that he had very little time left to live. His assistant Harry immediately sent for the supreme priest, but he could not help in any particular way. He said that most likely it was a curse that could not be removed by normal means. Alexandrita needed to be taken to the church. The disease was progressing too quickly. He didn't have time left. They had a much shorter period at their disposal than they had originally set. He is already almost on the verge of life and death, so he needs to be taken to a holy place. Harry was outraged. He believed that in such a state the prince would not be able to withstand the trip. However, the high priest tried to heal him enough to make this possible. He applied all his strength and energy, but the prince was too deeply affected. However, Alexandrite said that if there was even the slightest chance to prolong his life, he was ready to go to church. After which he asked if they had managed to find the one who had cast the spell. The high priest replied with regret that this had not yet been possible, although many government officials had been sent to identify the culprit. However, now all that was left was to try to keep the prince alive while he could. Something changed as the disease intensified its progress, and there was very little time left. If they could find the librum, an extract of which was rumored to help him, they might be able to cure him completely. But now, despite Harry's resistance, the prince had to be taken to church, to a holy place. Otherwise, its lifespan may be limited to a couple of days, and he will have to live through all of them in the greatest torment and suffering, which will ruin his last days. Alex told them to take him to the church. He was ready to endure this journey. The high priest said that in any case they would try to find every possible way to save him. Alexandrite looked at him, realizing that this most likely would not work. But there was still hope. His assistant looked at him sadly, but decided not to resist any longer and not waste time. The high priest told him to go to the church immediately. There was no point in wasting sacred minutes. At this time, Onyx, who was walking in the square, was outraged by Arianel's behavior. She kept grabbing his hand, pressing herself against him, and he tried to pull her away. At this time, Marin thought that perhaps she was too modest and should behave the same way. However, Arianel thought to herself that she herself did not really enjoy holding his hand, but it was necessary. Marin didn't know anything about her plans, so she was quietly upset to herself. She thought that this way she could gain more favor from Onyx, but in reality, it was not so. She herself would not have stuck to him like that, but this was the best option, allowing them to share with Marin. They had been walking for some time, but were starting to get tired. At this point, Citrine said that he had a plan for how they could spend more time together. He noticed a display window that stood nearby. Behind it was a women's clothing store. The owner happily greeted him by name, apparently. This was not his first time here. He began to happily select outfits for Arianel, rejecting one after another. He settled on one of them, but she thought it was terrible. Indeed, it seemed to be in complete bad taste. She looked like a shepherdess. However, Citrine said that he would take everything, which stunned Arianel. The store owner was happy with his choice, so they didn't even let her change. Arya insisted that she would be ashamed to appear near the prince in such an outfit, but he insisted that everything was fine. So she had to go out into the street in a terrible state. However, if you think about it, it wasn't all that bad, at least it wasn't vulgar. Arianel began searching for Onyx and Maren, and Citrine kept trying to grab her attention. He said that they were already having a good time together, or that Arianel was really in love with Onyx. If this is so, then it is better not to, because it is clear to the naked eye that love has arisen between his brother and Maren. Arianel stated that she would do everything possible to bring Maren together with Alexandrite. At this time, the saint herself headed in their direction, and she looked almost the same as Arianel. Whether it was the latest fashion trend or something else, but they really were almost identical. This amused the girls, who looked rather silly on their own, but very harmonious together. Both princes looked at them with confusion, not understanding what was wrong with modern fashion. Taking the opportunity, Citrine asked Onyx if he was really willing to participate in the fight for the title of king in order to be with Marine. He replied that this was a rather strange condition, and he had tried to challenge it more than once. The younger brother replied that it really seemed strange. Everyone was sure that Alexandrite would become king. Onyx replied that he had approached his father several times with a request to change the order, but had been refused each time. Well, what bothered him most was not that his father had established such a rule he was the king and had the right to do so. He was embarrassed that his older brother supported him. There was something unclean here. Onyx said he would still get the rule repealed. Citrine at that moment was thinking about something completely different in his life. Everything was decided by pleasure. He even wanted to win this girl exclusively for himself, and not for the sake of love. All he was interested in was entertainment and lots of girls. He loved gambling, he loved to try his luck. He only needed this girl so that he could get her first. He just wanted her to be kept from anyone else, only then would she have value to him. At this point, it seemed that all possible entertainment had been completed, and it was necessary to choose a further place for a walk. Arianel thought that if they were at the fountain now, a kiss would be inevitable, since Onyx and Maren were together all the time. However, she had to put in all her efforts, otherwise she would regret it for the rest of her life. To separate them, it was necessary to come up with another suitable entertainment in which everyone could participate together. She followed them and wondered what could be suitable for these purposes, since they were not ready to go to the castle. Suddenly, she heard from someone that the performance was about to begin. If you think about it, it's about a couple of hours' walk, by which time it will be getting dark and it will be time to go to dinner. Then the fountain would definitely be cancelled, and this was to her advantage, so she decided to suggest this option. Arya voiced her thoughts out loud, and someone asked if this was really that performance from the unknown troupe. Citrine said that in that case it would be better to go to the opera, but Arianel was unexpectedly supported by the saint. She wanted to see the traveling troupe, after which Arianel decided not to delay and go there immediately. She grabbed Maren's hand and pulled it with all her strength, but she didn't expect such a grip. However, Arianel was restless and persistently tried to achieve her goal. The performance took place in a square, and there were benches opposite where you could sit. The play was called Saint vs. Witch Librum. Arianel thought the title was interesting. Onyx sat again with a gloomy look as Arianel continued to follow her previous plan. She continued to wrap her arms around him as if to show her feelings for him. She did it with all the passion she was capable of, but she didn't drool on his hands. Maren thought that maybe she should do the same, but she didn't have the courage to do it. And Arianel thought to herself that being close, accidental touches were almost inevitable. As soon as she thought about it, Onyx and Maren accidentally collided with their hands, and they couldn't hold on. They immediately pulled their hands away, trying to apologize to each other, but Arianel knew that it was all for a reason. She was irritated by this whole situation, but she knew that she had to do everything to ensure that her pet survived. So she will interfere with Onyx and Maren as much as she needs, although she and the second prince have started to bicker. At that moment, Citrine pulled her up and told her to watch the show. This conversation was becoming indecent. Besides, she could have paid attention to him because he was nearby and was ready to pay attention to her. Considering that Onyx was not ready for this, her choice was obvious, but she was not ready to accept it. At that moment, the title of the play was announced, and this time Arianel realized that the Librum flower could save her favorite. She looked at the stage and couldn't believe that the solution was really so close. All she had to do was go out for a walk that she didn't want to take. Even her appearance at this performance was completely accidental. Nevertheless, she began to experience strange feelings. The presenter threw a flower from the stage into the crowd, which flew straight at her. It was a beautiful tricolor white flower with green leaves, which she tried so hard to examine. She seemed to have drawn him in with her gaze because he plopped right into her arms. Arya held it in her hands, not believing that the answer was so close. Could it really be that easy for her to get a flower that could heal her pet? However, at that moment she realized that he was artificial. He was not real. Despite her disappointment, she was glad that she at least now knew what he looked like. The saint said that she had seen this flower before in the books that her mother read to her. Later, she read fairy tales about this flower to the children in the orphanage with whom she worked. Arianel was surprised that she really had information about this flower because it was so important. None of those accompanying her understood why she was so agitated, but she really could not be calmed down. She remembered that according to the plot of the book, Alexandrite could only be healed with Librum extract. In order to do this, the saint and Alexandrite had to go on a journey, which Arya could not push them to do. Something always got in the way. But it had to happen, otherwise the desired happiness between them would not happen. And the high priest then said that with the help of this flower he could be completely cured. When she read this part, she was filled with so much love, seeing her favorite one happy. At this point, Onyx had completely gotten rid of her, trying to stay away. Arianel was coming up with a new plan in her head on how to get this flower to save her pet. Citrine again pointed out to her that she was paying too much attention to her middle brother, advising her to switch to the performance. There the action developed to the point that the king of the empire was struck by an unknown incurable disease. However, it was a curse that covered his entire arms with bruises. Then Arianel realized that Alexandrita had also been struck by the same curse from some witch. She began to watch what was happening on stage more closely. A saint appeared there and tried to heal the ruler using her power. However, he became weaker and weaker each time, and he was faced with imminent death. Arianel seemed to be alone in this room. She greedily absorbed every word. At the same time, she remembered from the book that very little was said about how to cure Alexandritis disease. She didn't understand why the writers were so greedy about describing a cure for this disease. However, the performance gave her a chance to learn more about it, so she tried not to miss a single word. On stage, the saint asked the witch why she did this. She replied that she wanted to kill the king, and now she would finish the job. At this, the witch laughed and said that the saint was too merciful, even to her. However, she was ready to make the curse worse, and for this she was going to give her life. Then it became even stronger, and the time of the king's death decreased. Arianel suddenly felt an unpleasant sensation. She realized that something bad was about to happen. Even though it was just a show, she knew something terrible could happen. And not with just anyone, but with her favorite, who was also subject to the curse. She realized that she needed to act immediately, so she decided to turn to the saint. Arya asked if the book she was talking about was still in the shelter. Marin replied that she was indeed there, and that the shelter itself was located near the church. Arianel asked to go there. She urgently needed this book. She was so worried that Marin couldn't refuse her to go there together. She had such a worried face that she understood that this was not without reason. Something was happening right now. And indeed, at this time Alexandrite was lying in the church, but the illness continued to take its toll. He was getting worse and worse, nothing could help him. At the same time, events related to the eldest prince were also taking place in the palace. The king was informed that they could not find the witch who cast the curse. He demanded that she be found immediately and burned so that the curse would disappear. However, this could not be done, and his son was dying at that moment. Not daring to share this information with anyone, he suffered in solitude. At that moment, his wife, the second queen of the empire, Opal, was coming down to him. She asked if Alexandrite was really that sick, to which she received an affirmative answer. Her husband was in despair. He did not know how to save his son. She tried to comfort him, assuring him that everything would be okay. At the same time, she hugged him, however. If you looked into her eyes, you could understand that she was not entirely innocent in this situation. When the carriage arrived at the church, it was already getting dark, and Arianel saw a magnificent sanctuary. She imagined it from the description, but she didn't think it was so beautiful. The shelter was right behind him, but they didn't have time to get there. At first, Arianel even wanted to kneel and perform some kind of ritual when entering this beautiful place. However, she did not have time to do anything. As an unexpected event immediately occurred getting out of the carriage, Marin twisted her leg. She lost her balance and could have fallen, but Arianel was distracted and didn't notice. She didn't have time to react, and as a result, it wasn't she who caught the saint. Onyx immediately came to her aid and helped her not to twist her leg. Arya didn't understand how he managed to always be useful. Were they really destined for each other? This made her mad with anger, as all chances for her favorite to be happy were lost. She pounced on Onyx and said that their help was absolutely not needed here. They could handle it themselves. He replied that they could not leave them alone. They had to accompany them. Citrine asked them not to quarrel, but at that moment a church minister came out. He said that he was very glad that the saint had returned, as her help was needed. She asked what exactly, but he still didn't answer. They needed to go inside the church, but they didn't expect what they saw inside. Arianel realized that it was not for nothing that her heart was pounding so much. Her premonition had not deceived her. Everything had become much worse. At this point, everyone else had to know the truth too, since it was no longer possible to hide it. There was a man in the church whom she loved madly, and whose life was fading with every minute. When the brothers saw Alexandrite, they were shocked. They really thought that he was engaged in state affairs. But he lay there, barely breathing, his whole body already covered with signs of illness. Onyx rushed to him. He asked how it was possible that the prince's illness had been hidden for so long. Arianel was even shocked by how he behaved towards his brother, how much he loved him. However, he did not calm down and said that they had the right to know that their brother was very ill, after which he began to demand that since he was the crown prince, all the doctors in the state should come to his aid. However, they answered him that doctors would not help here, the disease was different. He had very little time left. His last strength was supported by the holy place, but this could not last long. At that moment, Arianel said that she didn't think it would happen so quickly, because he was supposed to have time until spring. Everyone turned to look at her, asking if she knew about the illness, after which they cried out why she had not told anything, and also how she could have found out whether Alexandrite himself had told her. The high priest addressed Arianel directly and said that the disease had progressed greatly over the past week. However, Onyx did not calm down. He wanted to know how Arianel knew about the disease. He suspected that it was the result of her witchcraft. She didn't know what to answer. She couldn't tell the truth, so she decided to resort to trickery. She said that she sees prophetic dreams in which she receives such information. She can see everything that will happen in the next year, but according to her dreams, Alex will also live much longer. She was surprised that the disease had taken hold of him so quickly. Perhaps the witch who cast the curse had made a sacrifice, as was the case in the play. Onyx asked why Arianel didn't tell them about it. She should have shared. She replied that she could not do this without Alexandrite's permission. To which Onyx said that she could ask him for this permission to tell his brothers, not to leave them in the dark. Arianel reminded that she did everything to save the prince from certain death. However, now it was necessary to act faster, otherwise it would not be stopped. She asked the high priest how much time Alex had left. He replied that at best a few days, provided that he would be in the church. After which she was asked how long ago she had seen dreams about the fate of Alexandrite. She replied that it was about 6 months ago, to which the priest replied that there was still plenty of time left. Then Onyx realized that it was precisely because of the illness that the king had come up with this condition to crown the middle brother. He clenched his fist, determined that he would not allow this, that he would not rule in his brother's place. Onyx asked how Alexandrite could be cured so as not to let him die. Arianel replied that the Librum flower, about which they had seen a performance today, was rumored to be able to completely heal him. However, she could not reveal all the truth she knew about him. Then they asked her what she had seen in her dreams about him. She answered that he was growing somewhere in the northern lands, but for this she needed to learn more about him from the saint. Onyx said that he would immediately go there for him, but Arianel could not tell the exact location. She said that in her dreams, Alex himself went with Marin to get this flower. They had a trip. However, now he is not able to do it. It turns out that the dream will not come true and he will die. All hopes are dashed as Alexandrite is simply unable to set out on his journey. In his dream, he was still quite healthy, but in reality, everything turned out differently. The high priest made it clear that Alexandrite would not be able to set out on the journey in any way, as it would threaten his life. He lay there, trying to utter words, but he couldn't, and all that came out was a kind of groaning. It was clear that another plan had to be found to save him. Arianel said that she had seen this dream about 6 months ago, to which the priest replied that there was still time left at that time. He could have lived for another year, but apparently the witch strengthened her curse. Then it turned out that Arya would not be able to see the plot that she read in the book. It was clear that everything needed to be changed, depending on what was happening now. At this moment, Alexandrite felt even worse. He was tormented by pain and began to moan. The high priest said that if he didn't help immediately, he might die and not live to see everyone find the librum. Alexandrite said that he was ready to leave. He had very little time left and asked that they not worry about him. However, at that moment the Holy Virgin rushed to the bed where the eldest prince was. She knelt down in front of him, gathering all her strength to be able to help him, and said that she would tell him everything she had read about the flower in the book. Marin put her hands on it, and divine energy flowed out, capable of healing. She was ready to give all her strength to ease Alexandrite's condition because she was distinguished by her ability to self-sacrifice. Arianel looked and understood that her plans were changing. There was no way Alexandrite would be able to cover such a long distance. Even now, he remained alive solely because the Holy Virgin decided to give him her powers. The high priest said that they would not be able to obtain librum this way. It was simply impossible. Arianel was confused. Everything she knew must have been related to Marin and Alexandrite's journey. However, at that moment, Citrine approached her and asked if it was really important that the eldest prince should go. And will the help of a Holy Virgin be needed somewhere there? Is it really impossible to do without it? Arianel thought about it. In fact, the saint was only needed to heal Alexandrite during the journey and tell him where the flower was. If others go, it is possible to obtain librum, but to do so, many things must be taken into account. Arianel asked the youngest prince what he was up to, as he looked quite cunning. At that moment, he said that others could also go on the journey. The high priest asked whom the young prince wanted to send, to which he received a completely unexpected answer. Citrine grabbed Arianel's hand, lifted her up, and said that the two of them were ready to set out. Arianel was outraged. He made the decision for her, and besides, he treated her so familiarly. However, he said that it was still necessary to go for the librum. Why not him? Besides, he thought to himself that during the journey he would be able to get closer to Arianel. She was indignant inside, since the scenario was not developing at all the way she wanted. However, Citrine could find his own explanation for all the objections of the high priest. When the church minister said it was too dangerous for the prince, he reminded him that there were many checkpoints in the country. Arianel remembered that Alexandrite and Marin easily overcame them, thanks to the fact that he was from the royal family. All he had to do was show the state seal to easily pass through all the checkpoints without delay. Citrine said that having the highest official in the country in the carriage would help the journey go faster. Arya realized that he was right, but they received another objection. The high priest noted that if a member of the ruling family was needed, why not take another? He reminded that there is another brother, Onyx, who is more prepared for this. Citrine still wanted to defend his proposal, but the high priest presented many facts in favor of Prince Onyx. First of all, he practiced martial arts every day. He was strong, reasonable, and could cope with any difficulties. On the road, there were bound to be some scary animals and some not-so-nice people. Even though Arianel wasn't very fond of Onyx, she knew that with him she would be protected. She also looked at Prince Citrine, who was not particularly masculine. She looked at his thin hands. It was unlikely that he would be able to protect them from danger with them. Onyx himself was not against it, as he wanted to save his brother, although he also didn't like the very idea of having to travel in Arianel's company. However, an event occurred that changed the course of further plans. The saint, who had spent all her divine power on healing Alexandrite, suddenly fell. This made Alex feel better, but she found herself in a difficult situation. Arya was very scared for her, because she knew no bounds when she did good. However, Onyx immediately managed to catch her, as if he sensed that she was unwell. Looking at him, she asked for forgiveness, that she could no longer help. She was too weak. He told her not to worry. He hugged her and rocked her. It was clear that his support was important to the saint. He was her support. Marin asked for forgiveness once again since she could no longer help. Now her strength was running out. Onyx understood that he couldn't leave her alone. He carefully calmed her down. She looked at him with such gratitude that it was clear that even his presence was helping her. Standing next to Citrine, Arianel realized that no matter how much she wanted the saint to be with her favorite, feelings could not be changed. Even she, despite all her desires to bring the two together, understood that there was a special connection between Marin and the second prince. They helped each other, supporting each other with just one look, as if they were made for each other. Arianel understood that it was almost impossible to unite Marin with Alexandrite, since she already had feelings for another. Despite everything, an immediate decision had to be made, since now only librum could save her favorite. She decided to accept Citrine's offer since there was nothing else left. But she had to act immediately. Her favorite's life was hanging by a thread. He needed urgent help. Looking at Marin and Onyx, she stood up, asking Marin to tell her everything she knew about Libram. Then she announced to everyone that Onyx had better stay and support Marin. They would set off on their journey with Citrine. After that, she approached the middle prince and said that now his task was to protect Marin, that he needed to provide her with all-powerful assistance and look after her while she was gone. Onyx replied that he could handle everything he saw, that she was selfless in her requests. Marin apologized to Arianel for not being able to go on the journey with her. It was so sweet that even in a difficult situation, the saint thought about her. Arianel promised that she would handle it herself, asking Marin to take care of herself. The saint wished her to successfully avoid all difficulties and asked that she return alive and unharmed. Arianel thought to herself that thanks to the fact that she studied all the lines in detail and participated in discussions on the forums, she knew a lot. She replied that she could cope with the task, and the saint was left to try to maintain life in Alexandrita. She answered seriously that she would do everything possible to ensure that he did not die before their return. After this, the girls hugged. It was clear that not very easy times lay ahead for both of them. However, they had very pleasant feelings for each other, trusting each other completely. At this point, Onyx noted that Alexandrite began to show signs of life. He said something, but not everyone could hear it. The first prince at that moment thanked fate for the fact that he was able to see her again. Now he could die in peace, since he heard again that voice, which he considered to be a manifestation of a miracle. Arianel was near again. He saw and heard only her. He wanted her to be near. Extending a weak hand, he tried to reach her, to feel her one last time. For him, she was a deity, a reason to hold on in this life and not give up. He tried to capture every moment with her, while trying to say something in a weak voice. Arianel could hear him asking her not to leave, asking her to stay with him. He held her outstretched hand with his weak one, wanting to prolong these moments. However, it still became harder for him, so Arianel replied that she could not stay. At that moment, the saint asked him to save his strength so that he could live until their return. Arianel looked at him, trying to calm him with her gaze and nourish him with her love. At that moment, sitting next to the prince, she asked him to hold on. After that, she said that they needed to get ready and leave immediately. Prince Citrine ordered that the best warriors be gathered to guard them on the way. Arianel said goodbye to Marin again, asking her to be careful. Marin wished her a safe journey, telling her everything she knew about the flower so that her mission would be successful. After that, Citrine and Arianel headed towards the exit. They still had a lot to do before leaving. Onyx watched her trail and didn't understand whether he should really trust this strange woman. Marin, standing next to him, understood his feelings, so she asked what was wrong with him. Didn't he believe Arya that she was doing all this for the sake of Alexandrite's happiness? Onyx replied that he did not know whether he could trust her, to which the saint expressed her arguments. She said she felt like Arianel was just like her. Not in appearance, not in convictions, not in character, but there was something close between them. The saint felt that she could be trusted unconditionally, since she was, in a way, her reflection. Onyx didn't understand where she got such feelings from, but she replied that they were there from the very beginning. Arianel is very similar to her. The saint simply did not know that she was reading the book on her behalf. However, Marin was convinced that Arianel could handle everything and that her thoughts were the most generous. They turned their attention back to the eldest prince, checking his condition. The saint tried with all her might to ease his pain so that the weight would not be so destructive. She put all her strength into making sure that the dangerous journey that Arianel and Citrine had planned was not in vain. Marin sat on her knees and prayed fervently that everything would work out as planned and the prince would survive. After all, great trials lay ahead of them, which could have ended in a bad way. At this point, the carriage was already assembled. The travelers set off on their journey, but there was another person who was necessary for the trip next to them. She held Arianel tightly to her, and she thought she was about to give up her spirit. Nevertheless, the girl rejoiced loudly, not allowing her to free herself from her embrace. Of course it was Nadia. She was simply irreplaceable on this trip. Citrine looked at her and thought that allowing a maid to behave like this was not very wise. However, Arianel reassured him, saying that Nadia could be more caring. Citrine was not tempted by the idea of traveling in such company, but there was nowhere to go, since Arianel had the right to choose her own escorts. However, Arianel noted that Nadia would be very useful on this trip, as she had special abilities. She tried to tell the younger prince about them, noting that without her they would have a much more difficult time. He asked Nadia what they consisted of. It infuriated him that she was behaving as if she were not sitting in the same carriage with royalty. All that interested her was her beloved Arianel. for whom she was ready to give her life. I wondered how she could help them on such a journey. To his question, Nadia answered that she could stop the storm for the sake of her beloved mistress. She will not let anyone hurt her and will be able to defeat all opponents. Arianel was both delighted and a little frightened by such zeal, but without Nadia it was impossible to reach the goal. The prince noted that it had quite good qualities and would probably really come in handy on the road. Nadia was absolutely convinced of this, and at the same time she took the utmost care of her mistress. Citrine said that they needed to discuss what they would do and where they were going. Nadia was a little surprised that so much depended on her little Arianel now. She was even more surprised that she had prophetic dreams that she didn't know about. The maid looked so closely at her mistress that she was afraid that she would notice the substitution. After all, the likelihood that the real Arianel had prophetic dreams is minimal. At the same time, Arianel was very afraid of what Nadia would do to her if she noticed the substitution. It especially scared her when she looked at her with such a look, as if she was trying to read. After all, she loved her mistress so much and took care of her from a young age that one could understand that this was a different person. Only Nadia smiled here. Arianel felt a sense of relief. She realized that the danger was behind her. She hugged her little girl again, who said that she didn't want to talk about the prophetic dreams so as not to worry Nadia. At this moment, Prince Citrin pulled Arianel towards him to discuss further plans. He behaved with her quite familiarly, putting his hand on her shoulder and asking her to show him the way. This is what the saint explained to her. She did not know more. Nadia was outraged by his behavior and miraculously did not explode. However, Arianel asked her not to interfere. She opened the map and began to show the way. They had to pass through the village of Stemi, but the prince needed to know something about it. When she told the story, Nadia looked at her with such admiring eyes, wondering how her little girl had grown up so quickly. Arianel replied that in this village many people suffer from diseases. Once they get there, they will need to perform a series of actions that were in her dreams, or more accurately, in the novel. Arya said that it was thanks to the people of this village that they would know where to go next. After which, she added that now they needed to think about where to stay for the night, since it was already getting dark. It was dangerous to set out after sunset, so they needed to find a place to sleep. The prince said that everything would be as she said, at which point Nadia volunteered to find the best place to spend the night. Arianel thought that she had imagined it all completely differently, but now there were different characters, but the action was the same. She looked at Prince Citrin, who did not have such a deep love for the people as Alexandrite. So it seemed to her that it would be quite difficult to do what his brother had managed to do. After all, they had to get hold of a very important artifact before the end of the journey, which could decide the outcome of the entire action. However, it got dark and they settled down in their chambers, which were distinguished by excessive luxury. Arianel understood that there were special places prepared for the princes where they could rest. However, I didn't think that everything would be so luxurious. Nevertheless, the amenities were a joy. After the journey, Citrine soaked in the bath, thinking about what was wrong with this girl. She did not react to his charm in any way. It even seemed to him that she was in love with Alexandrite. During the journey, she was so thoughtful that it seemed to him that she was floating somewhere in the clouds. The prince decided that he needed to immediately find out from her why she was so zealously trying to save the life of his older brother. So he decided to head to her right now to find out the matter. When he was almost dressed, he heard some noise in the corridor. Listening with all his might, he heard the servant say that the prince was already resting. Citrine immediately headed towards the door to see who wanted to see him. Arianel had almost left as she was not allowed to enter the chambers. However, he stopped the servant, telling Arianel to state the reason for her visit. She told him that they needed to discuss next steps, but it was inconvenient to do so in the hallway now. He thought that he would not have believed it if someone had told him that Arianel would come to him herself at night. However, she said that there were a few things that needed to be discussed before heading to the village. Then he invited her in, since it was indeed somewhat awkward to discuss them in front of the servant. Arianel was amazed by the luxury with which the youngest prince of the state was accommodated. Indeed, everything was done in the best possible way for the highest representatives of power. However, she had a very important mission right now that required her attention, so she decided to switch. In her excitement, she didn't notice that she was about to start having a nosebleed, which always made life miserable. Citrine thought that at this moment he could easily take possession of the girl he so passionately desired. However, she didn't pay attention, as she needed to get together to discuss further steps. Nevertheless, Citrine turned her towards him and asked if she understood how easy it was for him to take possession of her now. After all, she came to the man's chambers unaccompanied. Few could resist his charm. At this point, Arianelle's nose started to bleed because she was so nervous, but she had something to show the prince. In her hand, she held a manual that she had been compiling for a long time, and it described everything step by step. The prince tried to draw attention to her nosebleed, but she was too absorbed in her thoughts. This manual described all the advantages of Prince Alexandrite that she had been highlighting for so long. Moreover, it contained all the necessary information about his behavior and how he achieved his goals. She considered the young prince not very suitable for this role, but there were no other options. After an additional mention of a nosebleed, she still used a handkerchief so as not to embarrass the prince. However, she knew she was worried because there were so many important factors that would influence the final events. During this trip, Alexandrite and Marin were supposed to fall in love, but everything did not go according to plan. There are different characters now, so they needed to discuss what would happen in this village. Trying to hold back her nosebleed, she said that Citrine needed to be well prepared. He noted that she knew too much about Alexandrite. Although she herself tried to introduce him to Marin, "What's the matter?" She replied that he was one of her idols. He was her favorite. For Citrine, this word was incomprehensible. He asked what it meant to be her favorite, but then suddenly remembered where Nadia had gone. Knowing her desire to protect and control her mistress, it was surprising that she was not with them. Arianelle replied that she was able to keep her in her chambers, giving them the opportunity to talk about future plans. The prince was amazed by the girl's cunning, but did not raise any objections. However, he asked why she wanted him to study this Talmud she had compiled about his older brother. Arya replied that in her dream, Alexandrita managed to convince special people to take their side, who were supposed to help them in implementing their plans. Citrine didn't understand what they needed to do since they were just villagers. Arianelle replied that a lot depended on them and that they would need to obtain an important artifact. According to her dreams, many residents of this village were suffering from serious illnesses but could not get medicine. It was kept by one family who sold it at exorbitant prices. The medicine was capable of curing almost any disease, but it turned out to be unavailable. It was the Baron and Baroness who saved the potion not only for themselves, but could also sell it, but the villagers did not have that kind of money. They profited from them, while ordinary people simply died from infections. In the book, it was said that when Alexandrite and Marin arrived at the village, they found out about this. Then Marin healed them all with her sacred power, after which they went to the Baron and Baroness. Alexandrite, using all his diplomatic skills, managed to come to an agreement with them. He said that it didn't matter what mistakes they had made in the past. What mattered was doing the right thing now. Alex said that as the future ruler of this country, he wants the villagers to become his allies, as well as the Baron and Baroness. He said they could change the way they were treated by giving the villagers the medicine they so desperately needed. For this, he was supposed to receive a vital artifact that would later help find the Librum and get it. This is a pendant that belonged to the baronial family and was kept as a true heirloom. If they couldn't get it, further travel was pointless, since it was the key. Arianelle understood that the young prince was far from Alexandrite in his qualities. However, he could be taught, since she had written down the phrases he was supposed to say. They had the task of making him learn them by heart and then use them during conversation. Otherwise, there was no hope of success. The whole journey would have been in vain. Citrine was amazed, but he did not understand why Arianelle was collecting so much information about Alexandrite. After all, only if you love can you be so interested in a person, and she knew almost everything about him. He asked if she was really in love with him, because there was no other explanation. The prince approached her to find out why she was behaving this way. He wanted to know if she really had feelings for Alexandrite, because then his plan to seduce her would fall apart. Leaning towards her, he asked her what she felt for his brother. After all, if there is a real feeling, it is possible that it simply has no chance. Looking at him, Arianelle simply said that Alexandrite was her favorite. This is the kind of person who inspires with his behavior, helps to cope with life's difficulties, showing his example. A pet is something beautiful, a person you want to study, understand, and just see. Citrine asked if maybe then he too could become her favorite. What needs to be done for this? Arianelle seemed to have returned to her former self when everything in the world was concluded in love for Alexandrite. She said that it is very difficult to become a favorite because there must be real feelings. When it is there, the whole world becomes different, it becomes beautiful, and blazes with bright colors. Citrine was shocked. He didn't think that someone could have such strong feelings for his brother. He asked why then she said that she did not love Alexandrite if everything was obvious. Arianelle replied that he was a deity to her, the best in the world, but that was not love. Because an ordinary person cannot love a deity, since with his set of qualities she is far from him. Citrine looked over the paper she had written about his older brother again, and noted that she was indeed praising him. Arianel said that only another deity can love a deity, and she is not a goddess. Saint Marin, who is a deity herself, is suitable for Alexandrita. Only in this case they can create a wonderful union since they are equal. Citrine said that maybe then she could love him, because she did not equate him with a deity. That is, he now has a chance to win the heart of this strange girl. Then he told her that he was ready to help her, but then she had to give him one promise. If he does everything, she will have to promise to promote him to her favorite. He would like to know what it's like to be adored by a girl like that. This was his main condition, with which he agreed to learn to behave like an Alexandrite. In fact, she had quite heavy and tough demands on him, but he wanted to become the object of her adoration. Arianel was outraged. It is impossible to become a favorite just by desire, because for this, you need more. Only the one who is able to give light in the most difficult times can be a favorite. When you are tired and exhausted and go home after work, only he can awaken courage in your soul. It is able to light a light in the soul and give real healing from all problems. It doesn't happen that you become a favorite just because you want to. Therefore, Citrine's idea seemed completely impossible. However, he loved difficult paths because if he managed to achieve his goal, he would erase one picture from his memory. The one where she looked at him with complete indifference, where she made him feel uninteresting. This was the very picture that the youngest prince did not want to remember, and he decided that he would achieve his goal. Moreover, now he knew how this could be done. Arianel reminded him that he needed to train all night to learn to behave as decently as Alexandrite. That's why she said that they wouldn't be able to sleep that night. They had a lot to walk. Citrine decided to himself that he would become her favorite during this night, but at dawn, nothing had changed. They were riding in a carriage again, and ahead of them was that same village. Therefore, it was necessary to concentrate as much as possible, since events would develop at lightning speed in the future. Looking at Citrine, she hoped that he would be able to handle this task, but he was quite stubborn. In any case, they did as much as they could in one night. They had no time left for more. During the training, Arianel broke into screams several times, demanding that Citrine pay more attention to this. He claimed that he was ready to correct his task. There was no need to push him so hard. Arianel mentally called out to the gods, begging for their plan to succeed. However, she didn't know how things would actually go because the characters were completely different at the moment. And what she read in the book might not have come true because the story was different. When they arrived in the village, they first went to the Baron and Baroness. Despite the warm welcome, it was clear that they considered it foolish for the prince to travel to such a remote place. However, they showed as much hospitality as possible, calling the younger prince the light of the empire. However, they wondered why the travelers decided to go on such a long journey, since the road was quite long. The Baron was especially perplexed and began to suspect something because they couldn't have just left. Arianel understood that in this case it was necessary to create an artificial reason to start a conversation. So she showed a petition that they supposedly received at the castle from the residents of that village. It said that the Baron and Baroness were depriving the residents of the opportunity to be cured. In addition, it was said that they were hiding medicines that could save them from diseases. Of course, there was no petition in reality, but they needed to come up with a reason to visit the castle. His owners were embarrassed by these words, but they denied it, saying that it was not true. At that moment, Arianel saw a bottle that was located very high on a shelf in the clock and decided to climb up there. It looked rather strange, especially since Nadia tried to stop her, worrying that she would kill herself. Nevertheless, Arianel managed to get hold of this bottle, which she presented to the stunned owners of the estate. She asked what it was if not the medicine they were talking about now. The Baroness did not know what to answer, but she said that their family had nothing to do with it. Besides, she was very insistent about it, and Arianel did not want to go into open hostility. The Baroness tried to take the bottle away from her. At that moment, Arianel swayed and was unable to stay on her feet. She was standing quite high, her foot just slipped. She decided that she would die before completing the plan. Flying down, she cursed herself and fate for ruining the future of her favorite. However, the landing was soft. She was simply caught by Prince Citrine, who turned out to be unusually strong. He held her down and stood her up on her feet, then told her not to worry. After this, he asked if he could finally begin his task. Arianel realized that this was exactly the right moment for which they had been preparing all night. In the original, of course, there was Alexandrite who used certain words. He said that he wanted to build a bright future together with their people, and even though the past elections and actions were a mistake, the future could be changed. If Citrine said all this, there would be no difficulties, but he simply stunned her. He said that now everyone hates the Baron and Baroness. Do they really want to live, constantly afraid that someone might do something bad to them? Wouldn't it be better if the peasants loved them and tried to help them in gratitude for saving their lives? After all, love and respect are much nicer and better. The Baron and Baroness looked at each other and thought. The prince continued, suggesting that it was disgusting when they were given unpleasant looks while walking, and it would be much nicer if people asked them how they were feeling and told them how wonderful they were today. After which he increased the effect of his words and asked what they would be more pleased to hear. The Baron and Baroness agreed that the second option would be preferable. The prince added that instead of doing petty nastiness and being hated, wouldn't it be better to charm all the villagers so that they would bring them gifts themselves? Wouldn't that be much more fun? Arianel understood that her favorite would never have said such words. However, apparently, Citrine was able to understand the secret desires of these people, and he acted in accordance with his vision of life and was able to reach their hearts. At that moment, looking at him, she was proud that he was able to manifest himself, albeit through different methods. As a teacher, she always took pride in seeing her children find ways to achieve what they wanted using their own methods. And now, Citrine managed to reach people's hearts, and then he simply continued to pursue his line. He asked if they were ready to distribute the medicine among the peasants themselves, to which he received an affirmative answer. After that, he turned to Arianel and asked if this was enough to become her favorite. And did he cope with his task as she wanted, or does he still need to try harder? Smiling cheerfully, Arianel replied that he had done 100 points out of 100. However, at that moment the prince remembered something, so he began to listen more attentively to the conversation between the Baron and the Baroness. Just a few seconds made him understand that not all goals had been achieved yet. He still needed to get something else. Continuing to listen, the prince decided that he would also achieve this goal, without which further progress was simply impossible. However, he decided to do it when Arianel was not looking, in order to make the biggest impression. When they rode away from the noble's castle, the round moon was shining brightly. It was already quite late. The horses moved forward slowly, but those sitting inside the carriage were pleased with how the day had gone. Arianel just let out a sigh, happy that they had managed to do the almost impossible. Nadia praised her abilities, but she said that it was all thanks to the prince. It was thanks to him that we managed to find the key to the hearts of these nobles and correct the injustice. He replied that there was no need to focus on it, he did what he had to. However, he looked closely at Arianel and said that he had received what she asked of him. After which, he showed her the pendant, without which they would not have been able to go further, which Arianel had practically forgotten about. He saw it on the Baroness's neck and then asked where he could buy it. Charmed by his charm, she said that she could give it to him, not hearing how her husband objected. Arianel was happy. All the pieces of the puzzle were in their hands. Now all that was left was a small matter. They needed to go to the Ice Palace to get the librum that would save Alexandrite. When the Ice Palace finally appeared on the horizon, their admiration knew no bounds. He looked absolutely stunning. Everything around him was sparkling with a clear blue light. The keeper of this place appeared to meet them and said that he would lead them to the Ice Temple. However, previously they had to go through many difficulties on their own, but now they have a guide. He said that he protects the librum from bad people. He is a servant of this temple. Even earlier, Arianel remembered that the book indicated that finding the entrance to the temple was not so easy. The only way to get there was to know that you had to go through a special gate. However, they were able to find themselves opposite him, although Prince Citrine asked many questions. He couldn't understand how she knew where to look for the entrance to this temple. Arianel was glad that she had found sufficient justification for her knowledge at the time, referring to prophetic dreams. However, she, like Citrine, was simply amazed when she saw all this with her own eyes. After all, the entrance was located inside the tree, and without knowing this, it would have been impossible to get there. But right after that, they got a little lost, because they didn't know where to go next. Everything was too dazzling. Therefore, the guide turned out to be just in time for them, otherwise they would have wandered around searching all night. They entered the temple, after which the minister said that they would have to pass a series of tests. He guarded this librum flower for many years, not allowing bad people to get close to it, and only those who were pure in soul and heart could pass his tests. While there was no evidence of this, the attendant, who identified himself as Zane, said that this was the place where they should stop. He will not let them in because they do not have the tools necessary to enter. Prince Citrine said they weren't going anywhere, it took them too long to get here. However, Zane replied that it was impossible to go further, a special attribute was needed to enter. Arianel now understood what was being discussed, because from the book she knew that if she did not get the necklace from the Baroness, having ensured that she and her husband shared the medicine, there would be no entry. So she showed it and said that they have a special attribute, they have already passed this test. Zane was amazed, after which he announced that they had passed the Holy Chapel test. Now they could gain the right to go further without stopping in this place for long. Citrine was amazed, as he didn't think that without the necklace they would have to stay here. They followed the magician, who, judging by the books, possessed not only white, but also black magic. There was a magnificence all around them that was difficult to describe in words, but they tried to absorb it all. Citrine said that since it was a necklace of noble blood, how could it be the key to the entrance? But Arianel did not want to explain. She realized that they had finally entered the testing hall, and that meant a lot now. Everything depended on her determination. Zane said that their final test was to solve the code on the wall. Once they open it, they will receive 3 letters that will help them open that chest. In the chest lay the key to the door that opened the further path. Zane said that many people have tried to decipher this code so far, but no one has succeeded. And just as he said whether they could cope, he heard Arianel say that everything was ready. He turned around, not believing her, but she was already taking the key from the chest. Holding it up to her, she showed that she had completed the task. Zane was amazed. No one had ever managed to do this before. He couldn't understand who could decipher the code so quickly. Nadia, as always, was delighted with her little mistress, but no one understood how she managed to do it. She replied that she had a magical gift of prophecy, so for her it was as easy as pie. Zane thought, because no one had been able to pass this code before, and she did it in just 1 second. In fact, this cipher was designed as a mini-game. You had to find 3 hidden Latin letters in the text of this world and make a word. And she was a huge fan of the book, so she just memorized it, which is why she was able to solve the code so quickly. Another test was over, bringing them 1 step closer to obtaining the Librum flower. After that, they stood in front of an ice door that had to be opened with the received key. Arianel understood that the trials could not end there. She was sure that something else awaited them. However, she remembered this moment vaguely, so she delayed opening the door, but nevertheless, she decided to do it. The necklace had to be inserted into the recess, and then the key had to be turned, Arianel's heart fluttering as she did this. The door paused briefly before opening. Everyone stood waiting to see what would happen next. Arianel asked Zane again if it was true that they would find Librum behind that door, to which she received a positive answer. When the door opened, she was glad that the way to him was open. However, Zane looked at her and wondered how she knew so much about this shrine, since there was no information about it anywhere. While she was looking forward with excitement, he wondered to himself who she was. However, Arianel didn't pay attention to anything and called everyone to go forward. It was dark inside, so Nadia was worried about her mistress. After this, Zane said that the test was not over yet, but did not say what was still ahead. However, Arianel said that she knows about it, so she is ready to take the next test. Zane was shocked, and then asked how she could know this, to which Arianel referred to her dreams. At this time, even the guards who were next to them heard some noise and growling and became frightened. They were supposed to protect them along the way, but they were unprepared for what they saw. It was a tame beast, a monster guarding the gates of the sanctuary that had to be defeated. Zane said that after this they can get what they came for. The frightened guard said that they could rely on them, but this was said in trembling voices, which did not sound very convincing. At this point, the monster had already opened its mouth, preparing to attack. However, Nadia immediately rushed forward to prevent it from harming her mistress. Looking at her, anyone would be scared, because she wouldn't even let anyone touch her beloved Arya with a finger. In fact, in the original book, Alexandrite and Marin together easily defeated the monster, acting as a pair. However, Arianel learned that the plot had changed, so an additional decision had to be made. Looking at the thin-looking Prince Citrine, she realized that it was unlikely that he would be able to show the same courage as his brother. That is why she took Nadia with her, who was ready to kill anyone just to save her mistress. So she considered her plan perfect. If everything continued like this, then they would easily reach the Librum. However, at that moment, something happened. Nadia's eyes became as if in love when she looked at this monster. It was as if she was bewitched, so the plan was failing before our eyes. The monster stood with its mouth open, frozen right in front of Arya, who didn't move. She looked at him, dismayed that Nadia couldn't handle him. However, at that moment the girl was reflected in the monster's eyes, and it stopped growling. As if it had penetrated her thoughts, it felt her whole soul, her love and desire to save the prince. After which the monster bowed its head before her, discouraging everyone around. Then something completely incredible happened. There were many splashes of blue flame that were blinding. And the big, scary monster, bowing his head before her, seemed to have become her servant. And then there was an even bigger explosion, as a result of which a small, cute creature appeared in the place of the monster. It jumped into Arianelle's arms, caressing her, which made her hands freeze, but her heart trembled very pleasantly. The publication was so cute that it was impossible not to fall in love with it, and yet there was nothing like that in the book. Everyone around was amazed that she managed not only to defeat the monster, but also to make it a tame animal. Zane was again amazed, since this creature never became attached to ordinary people, which meant that Arianelle was not one of them. However, he still did not understand who she was, and Nadia was worried that the monster could harm her. Finally, they came to the last doors, which were no longer guarded by anyone. Arianelle realized that they had finally arrived. The tame animal was sitting on her shoulder. Her heart sank with anticipation as the gates before them opened slightly. Everything around began to shine like the northern lights, with a beautiful blue glow. And Arianelle, throwing aside all caution, rushed towards the librum, which was simply in huge quantities in front of them. She finally did it. Her favorite will be saved, he will not die. Her mission is accomplished, and it does not matter that her second life will end. What is important is that Alexandrite will live.